The gaslight flickered along the Edgware Road, and the winter fog pressed close against the shop windows. A hackney driver, hunched inside his greatcoat, urged his horse toward Kilburn. It was the 28th of December, and the cold had teeth. Near a half-built house at Pineapple Gate, a labourer named Bond stepped from the path to rest his shovel. He caught the shape at once, wrapped in a coarse sack, half hidden by frostbitten weeds. He thought at first it was a bundle of rags thrown out by builders. He bent closer. The sacking was stiff with something darker than mud. He drew back the cloth, and the fog seemed to hold its breath. There in the wet grass lay the torso of a woman, the head and the limbs gone, and London, though it did not yet know, had begun its hunt. The bundle at Pineapple Gate. Good evening and welcome. Welcome back if you have been here before, and welcome for the first time if you have not. This is the Bedside Historian, and the hour is late, and the world outside your window has grown quiet enough for us to speak in a low voice about things that happened long ago. Tell me, before we begin, where you are listening from tonight. A bedroom in a city that never quite falls silent, perhaps, or a small house at the edge of a village where the last lamp on the lane has already gone out. Tell me the time on your side of the night. Whatever it is, I am glad you are here. If you would, before we drift, press the small button that says subscribe, and give the video a like if the sound of my voice is a comfort to you. It costs you nothing, and it helps this quiet channel to grow, so that more nights like this one can find their way to more listeners like you. Thank you. Now settle in. Let your shoulders fall. Let the day you had, whatever it held, begin to loosen its grip. The story we are about to hear happened in London, in the last days of 1836, and it begins, as so many of these stories do, with a man doing a plain morning's work in the cold. The Edgware Road, in that winter, ran north out of the city into a country that was already beginning to disappear. Paddington, at the southern end, was a district of brick and gaslight, of taverns and coachyards, and the great new terminus of the Great Western Railway, then still under construction. A little further out, past Kilburn, the houses thinned and the fields began, and the road ran between hedges that were black with frost. In between, in the strip of ground between the last row of finished shops and the first true stretch of open land, the builders had begun to lay down what they meant to be a new suburb. Half-built houses stood along the road with their upper stories open to the sky. Piles of brick and stacks of timber waited for a thaw that was still weeks away. At a place the local people called Pineapple Gate, near the Pineapple Public House, one of these half-built houses stood back a little from the road, behind a rough patch of ground that had once been a market garden. It was here that a labourer named Bond, employed on the works, stepped aside from the path on the morning of the 28th of December to rest his shovel, and it was here that he saw the shape in the weeds that we spoke of in the opening. I want to walk back to that moment with you, slowly, and let the picture settle. The parish histories give us his name and his trade, and very little else. We do not know what he had eaten that morning, or what he had drunk the night before, or what he was thinking about as he trudged along the frozen road. The record does not tell us. What the record does tell us is that he saw a bundle wrapped in a coarse sack, half hidden by frost-bitten weeds, and that he thought, at first, that it was rags thrown out by the builders. This is worth pausing on for a breath. In London, in those years, rubbish was very often left where it fell, and a bundle of old cloth beside a half-built house was the least remarkable sight a working man could meet on his way to work. If Bond had walked past, if he had left the bundle for another to find, the whole shape of the case that follows would be different, and the name of James Greenacre might never have come into the newspapers at all. But he did not walk past. He stopped. He set the point of his shovel into the frozen earth and bent down. The sacking was stiff, the way cloth becomes stiff when it has been out in the cold for a long time, and it was heavier than a bundle of rags ought to be. He drew back one corner and then another. What lay inside was the torso of a woman, without head and without limbs, and the flesh of it was blue from the frost. We have to leave the ditch for a moment, you and I, and think about what it was to be a labouring man in England in that winter, Bond was not a constable and he was not a coroner. He had no training in what to do. What he had was a shovel, a mouth that had suddenly gone dry, and a shout. He straightened up and he called for the nearest of his fellow workmen, and within a few minutes there was a small ring of men standing around the sack in the weeds, none of them saying very much. One of them was sent to fetch the parish constable. Another was sent to fetch the beadle. The rest stayed with the bundle, because it did not seem right, on a morning like that, to leave a body alone in a ditch beside a road. The men who came were not what you or I, from our side of the years, might picture when we say the word policeman. The Metropolitan Police had been founded only 7 years earlier, in 1829, and the blue-coated new police were still, in the outer parishes, a thin and half-trusted presence. In Paddington and along the Edgware Road, there were also the older parish constables, and the beadles, and the night watchmen of the various wards, and in these first hours it was these local men who took charge. One of them, a constable of Paddington by the name of Pegler, is remembered in the newspaper columns of the following week. He knelt by the sack, he lifted the cloth, he looked, and he did what any man in his position would have done. He sent word to a surgeon. The word passed from mouth to mouth along the road. A crowd began to gather, as it always did, wherever something out of the ordinary happened in London. Boys ran up from the direction of the tavern. 2 women in shawls stood at a decent distance and did not look away. A carter drew up his horse and asked what was the matter, and when he was told, he crossed himself and drove on. By the middle of the morning, the news that a body had been found on the Edgware Road was already moving south into the city, in the way news moved in that decade, on the tongues of shopkeepers and delivery boys and hackney drivers, ahead of any printed page. You do not, in these first hours, have anything that a modern investigator would call a case. You have a torso. You have no head, no arms, no legs, no clothes, no papers, no ring, no scar that anyone has yet noticed, and no name. The woman on the ground could be anyone at all, and until a great many other things happen, she remains simply that. The unnamed woman. The bundle at Pineapple Gate. The horror on the Edgware Road, as the newspapers would soon begin to call her, though no one had yet chosen the phrase. The surgeon who came was a local man, and his first task, once the body had been removed, was the plain and grim one of describing what was there. He noted the sex. He noted, so far as he could, the age, and he wrote that the woman had been between 40 and 50 years old. He noted that she was, in his judgment, a woman who had done hard physical work in her life, and that her hands, if he had them, would probably have told him more. He did not have them. He noted that the flesh had been separated at the neck and at each shoulder and at each hip by cuts that were, in his careful phrase, made by a person of some knowledge, though not by a surgeon. He was choosing his words with care because he understood, as any surgeon in London in that decade would have understood, that his notes might one day be read out at the Old Bailey. We have to be honest here about what happened next, because it will matter later. The torso was placed upon a shutter, and it was carried, without any great ceremony, to the workhouse at Paddington, and there it was laid out in a cold room that served as a mortuary. This was the way of things then. There were no dedicated mortuaries in the parishes of outer London. The dead who could not be taken home were laid, more often than not, in workhouses or in the back rooms of taverns, and the men who watched over them were paid a few shillings for the trouble. On that afternoon, the 28th of December, a small paragraph was already being set in type at the offices of one of the evening papers, describing a discovery near the Pineapple public house of what appeared to be part of the body of a female. The word part was chosen with care. It was the only honest word. I have stood, once, on the stretch of the Edgware Road where all this began. It is not the same road at all. The half-built houses are long finished, and long since pulled down again and rebuilt, and the market gardens have been buried under brick and, later, under asphalt. There is a wide, busy street where the ditch was, and a chemist's shop and a bus stop, and traffic that never quite stops. If you had not read the papers of that winter, you would never know what was pulled from the frost there. I did not stay long. I only wanted, I think, to see what the ground felt like under my feet. It felt like nothing at all. That is the strange gift of a great city. It carries the memory of these things very lightly. Back in the cold room at the workhouse, the surgeon covered the torso with a sheet, and the parish officers began the paperwork that any death, however strange, required. A note was made of the hour of the discovery. A note was made of the finder's name. A note was made of the surgeon's initial report. Copies of these notes were sent by messenger to the coroner for the Western Division of Middlesex, a gentleman by the name of Sterling, and to the offices of the local magistrates. By the time the lamps were lit that evening along the Edgware Road, the machinery of an inquest was already turning, though very slowly, and no one yet had any idea whose death it was that was going to be inquired into. The evening papers that night carried the first thin notice of the case. The morning papers of the 29th carried longer paragraphs, and by the 30th the London public was reading, over breakfast, that a female torso had been found near Kilburn, that the head and the limbs were missing, and that the parish authorities were making every inquiry. From that moment onward, the story ceases to belong only to the parish of Paddington. It becomes, for the next 4 months, a story that belongs to the whole city, and beyond the city to every household that took a newspaper, and beyond that again to every tavern and every market where the news could travel by tongue. If you are still with me here in the dark, I want you to picture, before we close this first chapter, the small physical fact at the centre of everything that is now going to happen. Somewhere in London, on the night of the 28th of December in 1836, a woman was missing from her lodgings. She had a name, a trade, a room, a bed, a chair, a candle, a Sunday bonnet, and a set of friends who would sooner or later begin to wonder where she had gone. She had, we shall come to learn, been about to be married. She was not yet, in anyone's mind, the woman in the ditch. She was only, to those who knew her, a face that had failed to appear at an expected place, and it would take 3 months and 2 further discoveries before her name and the frozen thing at Pineapple Gate would meet. For tonight, then, we leave the parish officers to their inquest, and the surgeon to his careful notes, and we leave the crowd along the Edgware Road to drift, at last, back to their fires and their suppers. The gas lamps hiss above the pavement. A watchman calls the hour. The horse-drawn traffic thins to a trickle, and then to a single hackney, and then to none. In the workhouse, a candle burns low beside a sheet that covers a shape that has not yet been given back its name. Somewhere else in the city, in a set of rooms that no one has yet thought to look at, a cabinet maker sits by a small fire and does not sleep. A city of gaslight and rumour. The London that woke on the morning of the 29th of December, in the year 1836, was not yet the London of steam and telegraph that later schoolbooks would picture. That city was still being built. Only a handful of miles of iron track ran into the capital at all, and the great terminus at Euston stood half-finished behind its hoardings. No wires yet hummed beneath the pavements to carry a message from one end of the town to the other. When the printer set his type for the morning edition, the news he was setting had travelled to him on foot, or in a hansom, or on the tongue of a man who had walked from Paddington to Fleet Street in the dark hours before dawn. I want you to picture the city itself for a moment before we hear the rumour of it. Paddington, at the northwest edge of the built ground, was thickening into a district of terraces and coaching inns. Along the new road that ran past the great hospitals, the traffic was heavy from first light. Down toward the river, the wharves of Wapping and Rotherhithe were loud with the calls of watermen and the creak of cranes. Between these edges lay the older heart of the town, the streets of the Strand, of Holborn, of Cheapside, where the shop shutters came down at 7, and the pavements filled with clerks and apprentices moving toward their desks and their benches. Somewhere among them, on that morning, a laundress named Hannah Brown did not go to work. We shall come back to her, several chapters from now. She is not yet part of the story anyone is telling. She is only, at this hour, an absence that no one has noticed. The morning papers, spread out on the counters of the coffee-houses and the reading rooms, carried the first proper notice of the discovery near the Pineapple. The Times, on the 29th, printed a paragraph of some 10 lines under the heading "Extraordinary Discovery." The Morning Chronicle gave the case a longer notice, and the Morning Herald longer still. The evening editions of the Standard and the Globe expanded these into columns of 40 or 50 lines by tea time. None of them yet had a name to attach. What they had was a sack, a torso, a ditch, a labourer, a parish surgeon, and the northwest edge of the town under a hard frost. That was enough. In a city already hungry for a shock at the closing of the year, that was more than enough. You must remember what it was to buy a paper in that decade. A copy of the Times, on that Thursday morning, cost 7pence, which was more than the daily wage of a great many of the men and women who read it. The unstamped weeklies, the cheap sheets that stood on tables outside the taverns, could be had for a penny or a halfpenny, and it was in these that the story travelled fastest. A father would buy one on his way home from the docks and read it aloud to a wife who could not read, and a lodger over the wall would hear it through the boards, and by nightfall the whole tenement would be talking about the woman at Pineapple Gate, as though they had all been there themselves. The record does not tell us what the first such reading sounded like in any one house. We can only say that there were tens of thousands of them on that Thursday and the Friday and the Saturday after. The rumour did not stay long in Paddington. By the middle of the morning it had reached the coach yards at Charing Cross. By dinner time it had crossed the river to the Borough. By the fall of the winter dusk, at 4 in the afternoon, it was being told in the taverns of Wapping and out among the rope walks of Limehouse and Stepney, where the men who worked the ships had begun to gather at their firesides against the wind off the water. Each mouth added something. Each pair of ears took something away. A torso became, in the telling of one Carter, the body of a young woman of quality. In the mouth of a fishwife at Billingsgate, it was the body of an actress who had lately gone missing from the Adelphi. A watchman in Southwark would tell his relief, at midnight, that the head had been found and that it was the head of a foreign lady, and this last was a piece of pure invention, but it flew as far and as fast as any true report. Let me say something about that class of men called the costermongers, because they matter to how a piece of London news travelled in 1836, and because they will not be at the centre of our story again. They were the barrowmen of the streets, the sellers of oranges and apples and eels and cabbages, who wheeled their goods through the same routes day after day. Upward of 30,000 of them, by one estimate from a few years later, were at work across the capital. Each of them saw, in the course of one long day, more strangers than a country parson met in a year. What they heard from one buyer they passed to the next, without cost, and with a good deal of relish where the news was strange. A costermonger who took a lemon from a housewife in Paddington in the morning could carry the tale of the ditch as far as Whitechapel by dark, and in Whitechapel the tale would be exchanged again for whatever news had come up the river from the docks. This is how the story of the woman without a name became, within 48 hours, the property of a whole capital. Then there were the watchmen. The old parish watch had not been fully swallowed up by the new police, and in most wards the two systems still ran side by side. The watchmen were, for the most part, elderly men, kept on by the vestries because they had done the work all their lives, and because it was cheaper to pay them a few shillings a week than to pension them off. Their duty was to walk their beat every hour, to call the time, and to look out for fire and disorder. Their real work, in the deep hours after midnight, was to talk. They talked to each other at the corners of the streets. They talked to the drivers of the night cabs. They talked to the beggars asleep in the doorways, and they talked to the returning revellers who had missed the last omnibus. The rumour of the Edgware Road Horror passed along the watchman's chain the way a bucket of water passes along a fire chain, from Paddington east to Marylebone, from Marylebone south to Oxford Street, from Oxford Street across Holborn to the city proper, all in the space of one long, hard-frozen night. And then there were the gentlemen of the press. That phrase, in 1836, meant something more particular than it does now. There were, in the capital that Christmas, perhaps 8 or 10 daily newspapers of standing, and a great cloud of weeklies below them. Each of the dailies employed a small staff of reporters who went out into the streets in the morning with a notebook and a pencil, and came back in the afternoon with what they had gathered. They wore black coats and tall hats, and they were known, in the police courts and the coroner's rooms by sight. 2 of them at least went out to Paddington on the afternoon of the 28th, and one of them, a man whose name has not come down to us clearly, spoke to the labourer Bond and took down what Bond had seen. By the following morning, the words that had been said in the ditch were being read in the drawing-rooms of Bloomsbury. I have been trying, as we go along, to keep for you the honest limits of what we know. Here is one of those places to admit them. We do not know how many wrong things were said in the taverns of Stepney on that Friday night about the woman on the Edgware Road. We do not know how many husbands, coming home late from the docks, told their wives that a body had been found and misremembered whether it was of a woman or a child. We do not know how many respectable ladies in the terraces of Islington, opening their newspapers over their tea, decided at once that the missing woman must be the servant of a house nearby who had lately given notice. The rumour was, by its nature, unwritable. It happened in the air between people. It changed as it went. What survives in the record is the fragment that reached the coroner's ear, or the constable's, or the printer's, and made it onto a page. You have to imagine, too, what the streets themselves felt like in that last week of the year. The gas lamps had not yet been fitted to every road. There were fine stretches of Oxford Street and Regent Street that were bright with them, and there were whole runs of alley and mews, only a few doors away, that were as dark as any country lane. A woman going home alone from a workroom in Soho at 9 in the evening would step from a pool of yellow light into a stretch of full shadow and back again 6 times before she reached her door. In the days after the 28th, she went a little faster than she had gone the week before. She looked, without quite meaning to, at the men she passed. She listened more closely for the footfall behind her. The horror on the Edgware Road did not need to be true in the way the papers were making it true. It only needed to be there, in the general knowledge of the city, to change how the city moved in the dark. The coroner for the Western Division of Middlesex, a gentleman by the name of Sterling, opened his inquest at a public house in Paddington on the Friday, the 30th. This was the ordinary course. Inquests in London in that decade were held very often in taverns and parlour rooms, because the parishes had no other buildings suited to the business, and because the landlords, who charged a shilling or 2 for the use of the room, welcomed the trade at the bar. A jury of local tradesmen was sworn. The body was viewed, as the law required, in the outbuilding where it had been laid. The surgeon gave his evidence. The labourer Bond gave his. Pegler, the constable of Paddington, gave his. The jury retired for 1/4 of an hour and returned a verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown. There was no other verdict they could have returned, and the whole proceeding, from the swearing of the jury to the writing of the verdict on the coroner's papers, took a little more than 3 hours. We have to pause here and be plain about one thing, because it is easy from our side of the years to imagine the machinery of that inquest as clumsy, and to feel a little sorry for the men who ran it. They were not clumsy. They were doing, as well as they could, the work that a modern coroner's court and a modern laboratory would later share out between them, with only a surgeon's notes, a jury's common sense, and a landlord's back room to help them. They knew they had almost nothing. They said so. The verdict, wilful murder against some person or persons unknown, is not an evasion. It is a plain confession that the record, as it then stood, would carry them no further. Let me put my hand on the arm of this chapter for a moment and take you east, out of Paddington altogether, because the outline promised you Stepney and I do not want to break my promise. On that same Friday evening, in a public house on the Commercial Road, a Welsh sailor, lately off a coaster from Bristol, was reading the Standard aloud to a room full of dockers. He read slowly, because his eyes were not what they had been, and every few sentences someone at the fire would put in a question, and the reading would stop while the sailor thought about the answer. What was the age of the woman? They asked. Between 40 and 50, the paper said. Was there any mark upon her? None, the paper said, that would serve to know her. Had the head been found? It had not. Had the arms? They had not. Where was the ditch? Near the Pineapple on the road to Kilburn, said the sailor. though he had no idea, himself, where the pineapple stood, and none of the men at the fire had ever walked so far west in their lives. Somewhere in that room, we can be almost certain, there was a man who knew Hannah Brown. Not that he knew her name in connection with the case, and not that he could yet have made the join. She had lived at one time in the parish of St. George in the east, which was 2 streets away from where the sailor was reading, and she had washed the linen of families whose sons now stood at the bar. The record does not give us his face, and it does not give us the moment when a first unease might have crossed him. It only tells us that the news of the ditch on the Edgware Road reached Stepney on the Friday night of the 30th of December, and that it reached it in the voices of men who had never been to Paddington in their lives. And so, as the year turned toward its close, the capital held 2 things in its hand, and could not yet put them together. In the west, a body without a name. In the east, and in 100 workrooms and lodging-houses between, a scatter of women who had not been seen for a day or 2, any one of whom might be, and none of whom yet was, the woman in the ditch. The gas lamps hissed. The watchman called the hour. The presses in Fleet Street rolled on through the night. And in the workhouse at Paddington, on a shutter under a sheet, the shape that had once been a woman waited, without complaint, for someone to come at last and give her back her name. The lock at Regent's Canal. Let us go east now, you and I, out of Paddington and away from the ditch in the frost, and follow the sound of the Standard being read aloud in that Commercial Road tavern until we come to the water. The Regent's Canal, on the 6th of January in the year 1837, was frozen the whole of its length from the Grand Junction at Paddington to the Limehouse Basin. It had been frozen for the better part of a fortnight. The papers of that week spoke of the winter as one of the sharpest in living memory, and the men who worked the canal that morning would have agreed with them, and would have added in their own words that a frost of that hardness was a wretched thing for a boatman, because it stopped the barges and stopped the trade, and every day the ice held was a day without wages. The Regent's Canal, if you have not walked it, ran across the north of the city in a long curve, from the Great Basin at Paddington in the west, past the new Zoological Gardens at Regent's Park, on through Camden and Islington and Hoxton, and down at last to the Thames at Limehouse. Along its towpath the barge horses of that decade dragged in their long patient chains the coal and the timber and the brick that London ate every hour of every day. Where the ground fell away, the canal was carried through locks, each one worked by a lock-keeper who lived in a small cottage beside his gates, and each one named for something local, often a public house or a landowner or a forgotten trade. One of these, in the parish of Mile End, near where the canal turned south toward the river, was known as Ben Jonson's Lock, after Ben Jonson's fields that had once lain beside it. The name was already old in 1837, and was already puzzling to the boys of the neighbourhood, who had never heard of the poet. At about 8 in the morning of the 6th, a labourer by the name of Bond, and I have to stop here to be plain with you, because the same surname you heard in the first chapter turns up again in the second discovery, and I know how it looks. This was not the labourer of Pineapple Gate. It was a different man, of the same very common surname, a lockman's helper working at Ben Jonson's lock, and the coincidence has misled writers before now. The record is plain that there were 2 Bonds, unrelated, and I would not have you go to bed tonight with the wrong idea of it. He had come down the towpath from the direction of Old Ford, breaking the thin new ice at the edge of the water with the end of his boat hook, because it was his morning duty to keep the margins clear where the lock gates opened, so that the timber would not be strained when at last the thaw came. He was, by his own account at the inquest that followed, thinking of nothing in particular, only of his breakfast and of the cold in his fingers, when the hook struck something at the foot of the lock that gave back a sound he did not know. Not the wet knock of wood, not the hollow bump of a floating cask. Something denser. He stopped and he looked down into the water, and for a long moment he could make nothing out at all, because the ice above was clouded, and the light of that morning was thin and grey. He knelt on the edge of the wharf. He scraped at the ice with the flat of his hook. He saw, at length, in the frozen water, what he thought at first was a large stone of an odd shape, wrapped in some dark stuff. He worked at the ice for a further minute or two. He saw hair. He rose to his feet, and he walked back along the towpath to the lock cottage, and he said to the keeper, in a voice that the keeper afterwards described as very even, that there was a head in the ice at the foot of the gate. The lock-keeper's name was Cording. He was a Suffolk man who had come up to London as a boy and had worked the Regent's Canal since it was cut. He came out of his cottage with a longer hook and with a pair of iron tongs that he used, in the ordinary way, for lifting freight, and the two of them went back together to the gate. They did not, at that first hour, try to draw the head out of the water. They only worked at the ice around it, breaking it in pieces with the point of the hook and drawing the pieces aside, until they could see what it was they had. When they saw, Cording sent his boy running to fetch the nearest constable, and he stayed himself by the gate to keep away any passer-by. The record does not tell us what he said to the boy, or what he thought as he stood there. It only tells us that he did not leave the lock for the better part of 2 hours. The head, when at last it was drawn out with the tongs onto the frozen wharf, was that of a woman. It had been in the water for a considerable time. The face was so far gone from cold and immersion that no one who came to look at it in that first hour could say with any confidence what the woman had looked like in life. The hair, though, was long and thick and of a colour that the constable's later note described as light brown, going toward grey. There was a wound above the right eye, and there was, and this was a thing that would matter afterwards, a tooth missing from the front of the upper jaw, on the left side. The socket was clean and the surrounding gum was torn, and Cording, standing over it with the tongs still in his hand, said aloud that the tooth had been struck out and not drawn. You do not, in these first minutes, know that this head belongs to the torso at Paddington. Nobody standing on the wharf at Ben Jonson's lock on that morning would have leapt at once to that thought. The two places were more than 5 miles apart across the whole width of London. A head in a canal in Stepney was, on the face of it, a Stepney matter, and a torso in a ditch on the Edgware Road was, on the face of it, a Paddington matter. There is no wire between them. There is no shared office keeping a register of found human parts. There is only the London press, which has been printing paragraphs about the sack in the ditch for 9 days now, and which will, on the following morning, print paragraphs about the head in the ice. And there is the ordinary common sense of the men who read them. The constable who came to Ben Jonson's lock was one of the new police of the K Division, whose beat ran through Bethnal Green and Mile End and out toward Bow. He knelt by the head, and he did what he had been taught to do, which was to note down what he saw before he moved it. He noted the hair. He noted the missing tooth. He noted the wound above the eye. He wrote down the hour of the drawing out, and he wrote down the names of Bond and Cording and the boy, and he arranged for the head to be lifted onto a piece of clean sacking and carried to the workhouse of the parish of Stepney, where a room could be found for it. Then he sent, by a messenger, a note to Scotland Yard, and by another messenger, a note to the surgeon Girdwood. Charles Girdwood was, at that time, one of the police surgeons of the Metropolitan Police. He lived in the parish of Bethnal Green, and he had come by his police work in the ordinary way of a general practitioner of that decade, by being the nearest surgeon of good standing when a station needed one. He was not, so far as we can tell from the record, a man of any great vanity. The newspaper columns that describe him during the trial that came later speak of him as steady and cautious, and his reports were written in a hand that was, and I have looked at one of them, unusually clear. He walked, on the morning of the 6th of January, from his rooms to the Stepney workhouse, and he arrived a little before noon, and he began, without hurry, the work by which the head in the ice and the torso in Paddington would at last be brought together. I have to be honest with you about what this work was. It was not, in 1837, anything a modern reader would call forensic examination. There were no photographs. There were no fingerprints, of which no one had yet heard. There was no way to test blood, no way to type it, no way to say from a dried stain on a piece of sacking whether the stain was human or of a beast. What Girdwood had was his eyes, his hands, a tape measure, a set of scales, and the memory of a great many bodies he had seen in his life. What he had also was the parish surgeon's report from Paddington, sent across at his request by a running boy, and the shutter on which the torso had lain since the 28th of December. That torso had been kept, as the frost had held, in the outbuilding at Paddington Workhouse, and it had not yet been given a pauper's burial, because the coroner had ordered that it be held until further evidence came, and here at last, on the 6th of January, was the further evidence. Girdwood did not begin with the head. He began with the neck. He measured, in inches, the width of the neck at the point where it had been separated from the shoulders. He noted the angle of the cuts and the manner in which the flesh had been drawn back before the bone was severed. He wrote out what he found, and then he sent word to Paddington that the shutter and its burden should be brought to Stepney, and by 2 in the afternoon a cart was on its way, drawn by 2 horses, moving slowly through the icy streets from Marylebone, across Holborn, and down through Whitechapel to Mile End. In this way the 2 halves of a woman, who had never met each other for 9 days, were brought at last into the same room. You do not do this work in a hurry. Girdwood did not. He set the head on a clean cloth at one end of the table. He set the torso on a clean cloth at the other. He measured. He measured again. He noted the height at which the top vertebra sat when the head was placed against the torso, and he noted the way in which the 2 flat surfaces of the cut matched one another when he brought them close. He noted the diameter of the windpipe at the head and at the neck of the torso. He noted the colour of the flesh at the edge of the cuts, and the manner in which the skin had drawn back. And at the end of some hours of this he wrote out, in the plain, clear hand for which he was known, that in his considered opinion the head found at Ben Jonson's lock and the trunk found at Pineapple Gate were the head and trunk of one and the same person. The words did not travel out from that room as fast as one might think. Girdwood was a cautious man, and he wished to keep his opinion to the coroner and to the police in the first instance, and not to have it read aloud in a tavern before it had reached the men who could act upon it. But such caution, in the London of that year, was a thing very hard to keep. By the following morning, the 7th of January, the Times had a paragraph, not yet certain, that the head found in the Regent's Canal on the previous day was thought by the police to belong to the body found at Paddington 9 days before. By the 8th it was in every paper in the capital, and by the 10th it was in every paper in the country. The horror on the Edgware Road, as the phrase had already become, was now the horror on the Edgware Road and at Ben Jonson's lock, and the story that had belonged to Paddington now belonged, in equal measure, to Stepney. The record here is thin about the ordinary people who came to the doors of the workhouses in those days. We know that they came. The parish books of Stepney and of Paddington both note a stream of women and men who called at the porters' lodges through the 2nd week of January, asking whether they might be allowed to see the head or the torso. Some had sisters who had gone missing. Some had lodgers who had not paid their rent. 1 or 2 had wives from whom they had parted, in anger, some years before, and could not now be sure were still alive. In the ordinary way of workhouses, these callers were sent gently on. They were told that identifications were made by the police, and that the police were satisfied for the present that the head and the trunk were the same person, and that the search for the name went on. Some of them went away comforted. Others did not. There is one entry in the Stepney book that reads only, "In the plain hand of the porter, a woman calling for her daughter, sent away, returned twice, and I cannot read it now without a small pause. We are still in a case without a name." Girdwood has done his work well. He has joined a head to a body, and the coroner's inquest at Paddington will, within days, be adjourned to Stepney for the purpose of viewing the head, and a further verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown will be returned, exactly as before, because there is still no name to give. The tooth that was struck out will be noted in the papers. The colour of the hair will be noted. The estimated age, 40 to 50, will be repeated. Somewhere in London, a friend, a brother, a sister, will read one of these paragraphs over the following weeks, and will feel a first pull of dread that will not yet, quite, become certainty. And still, though the head is found and the trunk is found, the woman is not whole. There are the arms and the legs, and there is the sacking they were wrapped in, and there is a place where they were left, and none of this has yet come to light. The frost holds. The Regent's Canal remains frozen from end to end, and along the ditches and drains that ran through the fields south of the river, the ground is iron. It will not release what has been hidden in it until the weather turns. For the moment the search rests, and Girdwood locks the door of his examining room at Stepney, and the 2 horses that brought the shutter across the city are led back into their stalls, and the papers put the case aside for a day or 2 while other news is set. The thaw, when it comes, will bring the willow beds at Coldharbour Lane into a fresh softness, and it will bring with them the last of what has been kept in the cold ground of a hard winter. The osier bed at Coldharbour Lane. We must cross the river now, you and I, and put a good distance between ourselves and the room where the surgeon Girdwood locked his door. South of the Thames the ground lay under the same iron frost that had held the northern parishes, but the character of the country was other. Where Stepney and Mile End were streets and yards and warehouses running out toward the docks, the parishes of Camberwell and Brixton and Kennington were still, in these last weeks of 1836, turning into 1837, half country and half town. Market gardens ran up to the edge of the terraces. Sheep grazed on Peckham Rye. Between the older villages and the new roads that were being pushed out from the river, there lay meadows, ditches, willow beds, brickfields, and the wandering, half-drained watercourses of what had once been the marsh of Lambeth. Into that country, the last of the woman had been carried by a hand that no one yet knew. The month of January, in the year 1837, wore on. The frost, though it had broken briefly around the 10th, closed again by the 15th, and by the 20th, the Thames itself had ice thick enough at the shore for boys to walk out upon at Bermondsey and be shouted at by their mothers for it. This was the coldest winter within the memory of many living men. The papers spoke of ships trapped in the ice off the coast of Kent, and of coaches on the Great North Road that could not move for the drifts about Barnet, and of an old woman in a garret in Cripplegate, found dead in her chair, with the pen and the letter she had been writing frozen to the table beside her. In such a season, ditches froze hard, and a ditch that has frozen hard keeps its secrets very well. The story that had been the talk of every tavern in the last week of December did not vanish from the papers, but it thinned. There is only so much a printer can say about a case in which the police can announce no name and the coroner can return no other verdict. The paragraphs grew shorter. The columns that had led with the Edgware Road Horror on the 2nd of January led on the 12th with a robbery at a jeweller's in Cornhill, and on the 18th with a fire in Ratcliffe. Yet the story did not leave the mind of the town. In the parish rooms of Paddington, and in the rooms above the station house in Marylebone, and in the office of a man named Feltham of the A Division, whose name we shall come back to in a later chapter, the case was kept open. Sergeants went out. Notes were made. Descriptions of the tooth, the wound, the hair, were sent by hand and by the new mail coaches to the police offices of half the counties round London. Anyone who had a missing sister, a missing wife, a missing laundress, a missing servant, was to be encouraged to speak. Let me stop us here at the edge of a market garden south of Kennington Lane and admit what the record does not give us. We do not know, from any paper that survives, how the search of those weeks in January was organised in any detail. We know that the men of the new police did search. We know they walked the fields to the south. We know that a printed handbill was set up in the parishes describing the pieces that had been found and asking any person who had knowledge to come forward. What we do not have is a diary, or a duty book, or a plain daily list of the ground that was covered. So when I tell you, in a moment, that the last of the woman lay for the whole of January in a ditch not 4 miles from Scotland Yard, I want you to hear it as the record hears it, which is with a certain shame. She was there all along. The men who might have found her walked past the head of the lane a dozen times. You should know what an osier bed was, because the word will not mean much to a listener of our own century, and because the place at Coldharbour Lane owes its name to a trade that has gone. An osier is a kind of willow, cut back each year to a low stump so that it throws out a great crop of long, thin, whip-like rods, These rods, once dried, are the raw material of basket making, and the basket was, in the England of that year, the packing crate, the fruit hamper, the fish creel, the eel trap, the cradle, and the coffin of the poor. Every bakery, every fishmonger, every dairyman, every country carrier used baskets by the score. An osier bed was, therefore, a modest industrial ground. It ran in long flooded rows, the water kept up by a shallow ditch, and along the ditches the ordinary weeds of a wet English meadow grew thick: reeds, sedges, willow herb, and in the summer the yellow flag iris. Coldharbour Lane, in 1837, ran out from the top of Brixton toward Camberwell New Road, and along its northern side lay one of these beds, a stretch of ground of some 3 or 4 acres, owned, I believe, by the parish, or leased by the parish, to a basket maker of the neighbourhood, whose name is not recorded in the papers I have read. The 2nd of February, in that year, was a Thursday, and it was the first day on which the thaw could be felt to have taken firm hold. The papers of the following morning describe a south-westerly wind that had come up in the night, and a temperature that at noon of the Thursday stood some 10 degrees above freezing, and a great dripping and running of water from every gutter and every eave in the capital. In the ditches of Camberwell, the ice that had been iron for 6 weeks began to slump and to break at the edges, and the frozen mud beneath began to give up, at last, whatever it had been holding. A labourer by the name of Ford, who worked for a market gardener in the parish, was sent out at about 11 in the morning to clear the ditch at the top of the Osier bed, because his master wished, now that the thaw was in, to have the water running freely down toward the drains that led away to the Effra. Ford took a spade and a long-handled hook, and he began at the road end and worked his way in. He had not gone more than 20 yards when his hook caught, in the bottom of the ditch under the ice-broken water, on something that was neither stone nor root nor sunken branch. He worked at it. He drew it up. He saw at first only a piece of coarse dark cloth, of the kind used for wrapping meat or wrapping tools, and he thought, as men in that decade often thought when they found a bundle in a ditch, that he had found some stolen thing which the thief had thrown away in the night. He carried the bundle onto the bank. He set it down on the frozen grass. He undid the string, and then he sat back, and he did not touch it any further, and he sent the boy who had been with him, running for a constable. What Ford had drawn out of the ditch, wrapped in a piece of the same coarse sacking as had held the trunk at Pineapple Gate, were the legs of a woman, cut through at the hip and at the knee, and, in a second bundle a little further along the ditch which the constable and his men found when they came to look, the arms, cut through at the shoulder and at the elbow. They lay on the bank in the thin February sun. A crowd began to gather at the top of the lane and had to be kept back. Someone was sent, at a run, to fetch the surgeon of the parish, and someone else was sent, at a walk, to fetch a hurdle on which the bundles could be carried away, and a woman in a shawl came out of a cottage at the end of the lane, with a clean cloth, and gave it into the constable's hand without a word. We are 2 months into this story now, and the record has been giving up its evidence in pieces, and I want to pause for a moment on the fact that everything found so far had been wrapped in the same coarse dark cloth. Sacking is not, in itself, a rare thing. A grocer used it, a coal merchant used it, a cabinet maker used it to protect his work in transit, a night watchman used it against the cold on his beat. There must have been in the London of that year hundreds of thousands of yards of it in daily use. Yet the wrappings of the head, of the trunk, and of the limbs, when they were brought together at the Camberwell parish rooms on the evening of the 2nd of February, were, as the surgeon reported, of one piece with each other, cut from what appeared to have been the same length of goods. That was a thread. It was not yet a thread that led anywhere. But it lay there in the room, on the table beside the pieces, and the men who stood around it saw it and would remember it. Girdwood was sent for again, of course. This is the same police surgeon we met earlier, the steady Bethnal Green man who had joined the head to the trunk at Stepney Workhouse a month before. He came by cab across the river on the afternoon of the 2nd, and by the evening he was at his work in a room lent by the parish of Camberwell, with the arms and legs on the table and the notes of his earlier examination in his hand. This work was, in some ways, easier than the joining of the head to the trunk, because bone at the shoulder joint and bone at the hip joint carry patterns of wear and shape peculiar enough to their owner that a surgeon of experience can match them at once. He measured. He fitted the head of the femur to the socket of the pelvis. He fitted the humerus to the shoulder. He noted the ridges and the misshapen places of the bone. He wrote out, again in the clear, steady hand for which he was known, that in his opinion the arms and legs found at Coldharbour Lane, and the trunk found at Pineapple Gate, and the head found at Ben Jonson's Lock, were the arms, legs, trunk and head of one and the same woman. We can be plain now, at least, about what the coroner's men had before them. They had, for the first time since the 28th of December, a whole person, if a person can be called whole when she is laid out in 6 pieces upon a table in a borrowed parish room. They had a woman of some 40 to 50 years of age, of middling height, with light brown hair going toward grey, a wound above the right eye, and a front tooth struck from her upper jaw. They had 6 pieces of coarse, dark sacking cut from one length. They had 3 places of finding, spread across the whole width of London, from the Edgware Road in the northwest to Ben Jonson's Lock in the east to the willow beds south of the river. What they did not have, still, was a name. You have to feel, I think, if you sit for a moment with this fact, how strange and how heavy it must have been in the mind of Girdwood, and of the coroner, and of the men of the new police who were now working the case together. A woman had been killed. She had been carried, or driven, in pieces across the whole extent of the capital. Weeks had gone by, and the whole town knew of her, and yet nobody had come forward. Somewhere in London she had a name. Somewhere in London somebody had missed her. Somewhere in London somebody, we can now say from what came after, had made themselves believe that she had gone away of her own choosing, to Birmingham or to Liverpool or into the country, and had told her few friends that this was the case, and had waited to see whether the wrapping and the cutting would carry the pieces beyond the reach of any face that knew them. Let me lay one honest gap here on the table before I close this hour, because it is a real one. Nowhere in the papers of that first week of February is there a note of what Ford, the market gardener's labourer, did with the rest of his day. He gave his statement. He signed it with a mark, because he could not write, and I know he could not write from the mark itself, which survives in the file. Then he goes out of the record. He does not appear at the inquest, so far as I can find. He does not, later, take a place at the Old Bailey. The man who drew the arms and legs of a nameless woman out of a ditch in Camberwell on the day of the thaw went home to whatever supper his wife had for him, and he told her what he had seen, and the two of them, we may guess but cannot say, sat up rather later than they meant to, and thought about it. That is all we have. Sometimes that is all a record gives. The parish surgeon of Camberwell wrote out his notes. The pieces were laid on shutters, and were kept under clean linen through the night. A rumour went round the parish, as it had gone round the parish of Paddington on the 28th of December, and round the parish of Mile End on the 6th of January, and in the taverns of Brixton and Kennington that evening, the men who came in for their pint spoke of a woman without a name, whose arms and legs had been found in the willow beds. The papers of the 3rd of February took the story back onto their front columns. The Times spoke of the Edgware Road Horror at last approaching some clarity. The Morning Chronicle spoke of the willow beds as a place that should be searched further, in case anything more had been left there. The Standard, in the evening, spoke of a friend, or a brother, or a lodger, who must know something, and who must, in the name of Christian feeling, come forward. Somebody, at last, was listening. A washerwoman in Camberwell. I'll write Chapter 5 now, keeping to the two-voice structure, the sensory grain of 1837 London, and the Dewey 2500-word target. The days that followed the finding at Coldharbour Lane were the days in which a nameless woman becomes a named one, and I want to slow down with you here, because the moment when a body in a ditch turns back into a person with a trade and a room and a supper she used to cook is the moment on which a whole case can turn. Up to now, the pieces on the parish shutters have been described in the papers as those of a female of 40 to 50, of middling height, with light brown hair going toward grey. From the morning of the 7th of February, in the year 1837, they begin to be described by a name. The name is Hannah Brown. She was a washerwoman of the parish of Camberwell, though she had lived in a number of parishes in her time, and she was, at the hour of her death, some 5 weeks short of what would have been her wedding day. Let me tell you first how the name reached the police, because the manner of its coming matters. It did not come from a shopkeeper who recognised the tooth. It did not come from a landlady who had missed her rent. It came from a man walking, in his working clothes, into the station house at Paddington on the afternoon of the 6th of February, and asking, in a voice that the sergeant afterwards described as level but tired, whether he might speak to the officer in charge of the business of the woman in the sack. His name was William Gay. He was a broker of some sort of the neighbourhood of Ewer Street, in the parish of Southwark, and he was Hannah Brown's brother. He had not seen her in life since the Wednesday before Christmas. You can hear, if you sit with this for a moment, how long a road it had been for him to that station house door. 6 weeks had gone by since the 28th of December. Every week of that 6 he had heard, from a neighbour or from a girl who worked with his sister at the tubs, that Hannah had said, before she went, that she was going to be married and would be moving to a place of her own. Every week his own uneasiness had grown a little. He had gone, on the 3rd of January, to the room in which she had lodged, and had found the room let to a new tenant. He had gone, on the 10th, to the man she was said to be marrying, a cabinet maker of Carpenter's buildings whose name we shall come to properly in the next hour, and had been told that Hannah had left of her own choosing, and had gone to the country. He had gone to the woman who worked with her at the wash-house at Camberwell, and had been told that no letter had come. And then, on the 2nd of February, he had read in the paper about the arms and the legs at Coldharbour Lane, and something in the reading had settled his mind at last, and he had gone home and told his wife, and she had put on his best coat for him, and had made him go. I am doing him some small justice here, and I want to be honest that the record does not give me all of these steps in his own words. What the record gives me is his deposition, taken down that afternoon by a clerk at Paddington, in which he says only that he is the brother of Hannah Brown, that she was to have been married on Christmas Day, that she had not been heard of since, and that on reading of the finding at the Willow Beds, he had felt sure in his mind that the description was of his sister and had come at once. The steps in between, the visits to the room and to the wash-house and to the cabinet-maker, come out in the trial that followed. I am putting them here in their proper order in the story, but the record itself is a little quieter than my telling. That is a thing you should know. The sergeant at Paddington did not send Gay away. He took him upstairs, and he sent a boy running to fetch Inspector Feltham of the A Division, whose name has already touched this story, and whom we shall follow more closely in a later chapter. Feltham came in from another part of the town and sat with Gay in the small back room of the station, and put to him, one by one, the marks that the surgeon Girdwood had noted. Had his sister a wound above the right eye? She had not, but she had a scar there, from a fall as a girl. Had his sister a front tooth struck from her upper jaw? Here Gay paused. He said, at length, that his sister had lost a front tooth in the summer, and that she had spoken of it with some feeling, because she had thought at her age it was not a thing that would happen. He said the tooth had been the left front of the upper jaw, and that after it had gone she had, when she laughed, put her hand up in front of her mouth in a way that was new. Feltham wrote this down. He asked whether Hannah's hair had been light brown going toward grey. Gay said it had. You do not, I think, need me to draw the moment out. The two men sat on either side of a scarred deal table in a back room in Marylebone with a coal fire that had been let to burn low, and the elder man, who was the brother, understood in that hour that his sister had been the woman in the ditch, and the younger man, who was the inspector, understood that his case, which had for 6 weeks been a case without a name, was now a case with a name, and though he had not yet said the word aloud, with a suspect. There was no hurrying it. Gay wept for a time. Feltham let him weep. And then a clerk came in with pen and paper and took down the deposition, and Gay signed it, and it was witnessed, and one copy was sent by the evening post to the coroner, and one was kept in the drawer of Feltham's desk against the morning. Let me tell you what we know of Hannah Brown, because now that she has a name, she is a person and not a bundle, and it is the right of a person to have their life spoken of before their death. She was born in the parish of Norwood, in the county of Middlesex, in the 1780s, in a year that no register I have looked at agrees upon exactly. The parish books give her age at death as 47, and I have kept to that number, though one paper of the day set her at 50 and one at 45, and the truth, as with many women of the labouring sort in that decade, will most likely never be exactly known. She was married in her young womanhood to a man named Brown, of whom the record tells us almost nothing except that he had been a shoemaker, and that he had died some years before the events we are speaking of, and that she had kept his surname for the rest of her life, as widows in that decade did. She lived, in her middle years, by taking in washing. This was, I should tell you, one of the hardest trades a woman of London could follow. A washerwoman rose at 4 or 5 in the morning to light the copper. She stood, from breakfast until dark, over tubs of scalding water that took the skin off her hands within a year of beginning. She lifted wet sheets that weighed, when soaked, more than a small child. She wrung them by hand and by mangle. She hung them in whatever yard or garret she could find, and in a London winter she hung them again and again over stoves indoors when the yards would not dry them. Her fingers cracked. Her back curved. Her wages, if she worked for a middling household in Camberwell in the 1830s, ran to about 18 pence a day, and her food, which was to say something between 3 and 4 shillings a week if she worked 6 days, and a shilling less if she worked only 5, and out of that she paid rent for her room, and coal for her fire, and the small copper for her own washing, when at last she washed her own linen at the end of a Saturday night. Hannah, in the year before her death, had been lodging in a room at Union Street in the parish of Camberwell, where she rented from a Mrs. Blanchard who kept the house, and who took in a lodger or two of respectable character. She had a small trunk of clothing, a Bible with her name written on the flyleaf in a hand not her own, a pair of pattens she wore over her shoes in wet weather, and a wedding gown of pale grey silk, bought second-hand from a dealer in the Waterloo Road, for something a little under £2, which is to say the wages of some 7 or 8 weeks. She had been engaged to be married, in the closing weeks of that year, to a widower and cabinet-maker of the neighbourhood of Camberwell, whom she had met, so the trial afterwards said, through a mutual acquaintance in a place of worship in the district some months before. The wedding was to have been on Christmas Day of 1836, in the parish church at Camberwell, and she had told her friends and her fellow washerwomen at the tubs that after the wedding she would be moving to her husband's rooms and would no longer be taking in laundry, and that she was, at last, at the end of that trade. There is a photograph, I want to say, and then I want to correct myself, because there is not. There was no photograph of Hannah Brown. The daguerreotype was 3 years off from being announced, and the plain fact is that we have no image of her face at all. What we have is one line in a paper of the following week that describes her as a stout woman of a fresh colour, with light brown hair going toward grey, and a manner that was, in the reporter's word, cheerful. That is the whole of the portrait. That is what has to do. Everything else about her, the way she stood at the tub, the way she laughed with her hand up in front of the missing tooth, the way she folded a sheet, the way she spoke of Christmas Day, must be built out of the ordinary furniture of the trade and the parish, and I have tried not to build too much of it, because it is her life and not mine. Gay's deposition was taken to the coroner that same night. The coroner, in his turn, arranged for a fresh sitting of the inquest, this time at Camberwell rather than at Paddington, at which Gay would be asked to view the pieces on the shutter and to swear whether or not they were his sister. This viewing took place on the morning of the 7th of February. It was, by every account, a terrible thing. Gay was led into the room by a constable. The linen was drawn back from the head. He stood without moving for a great while. He was asked whether he knew the face. He said that he did not know the face, because the face was gone, but that he knew the hair, and he knew the tooth, and he knew the scar above the right eye, and that he was certain, on his oath, that this was Hannah, his sister. The linen was drawn back from the trunk. He was asked whether he knew any mark upon it. He said that he did not, because he had not seen his sister undressed since the two of them had been children, but that the neck of the trunk, when the head was set beside it, was the neck of Hannah, and that he was certain. The coroner recorded his testimony. The jury conferred for a very short time. They returned a verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown, and the name of the deceased for the first time was written in the coroner's book as Hannah Brown. That name, once written, travelled. It was in the evening papers of the 7th, in the morning papers of the 8th, in the country papers by the 10th. Every washerwoman in Camberwell and Kennington and Peckham heard it and said, to each other over the tubs, that she had known Hannah, or had known her mother, or had seen her at the church, or had spoken to her at the wedding clothes dealer in the Waterloo Road, only in the middle of December. 2 or 3 fresh witnesses came forward at once to the police to say that they had seen Hannah alive on the evening of the 24th of December in the company of a man walking east along the new road toward Camden Town. The description of the man, given by each of them separately, agreed in the main points. He was of middle height. He was in a dark coat. He carried himself well. He had a voice that one of them described as soft and educated. He was, they said, the man Hannah had spoken of as her intended husband. We are still at some distance, in this hour, from the door at Carpenter's Buildings that Feltham will be climbing before long. But the door is not now the anonymous door it has been for 6 weeks. It has a house behind it, and a room, and a man in the room, and a woman who is not Hannah Brown, but who now shares those rooms with him, and a small child, and a set of pawn tickets that will matter in a way that no one has yet guessed. From this evening in Camberwell, when Gay walks home along the New Kent Road with the coroner's paper folded in his coat and his sister's name at last spoken aloud in a public place, the case ceases to be a search for who, and becomes a search for how, and the officers of the A Division, and Inspector Feltham most of all, begin to walk, very quietly, in the direction of a widower and cabinet maker of the parish of Camberwell, whose name has not yet appeared in any of the papers, but who, in the ordinary way of these things, must know already that at last they are coming for him. The cabinet maker of Carpenter's Buildings. The road from the room at Union Street to the door at Carpenter's Buildings, on the morning of the 24th of December in the year 1836, was not a long walk, and Hannah Brown, so far as the witnesses who came forward later could piece it together, made it on foot. We can follow her in the mind now, if you will let me lead you back into that morning, though the houses on either side of that road are long since torn down, and the road itself has been renamed twice, and the parish through which it passed is now a district of buses and traffic lights, and the low hum of a city that would have made the ears of a woman of 1836 ring like a struck bell. She rose, that morning, at the ordinary hour of a lodger in a Camberwell house, which was to say somewhere between 6 and 7, in the last of the winter dark. Mrs. Blanchard, her landlady, spoke afterwards to the officers of the parish about the little of that morning she had seen. Hannah had come down to the kitchen at about 7:30, in her working dress, and had taken a cup of tea with a piece of bread and butter, and had spoken to her, in the ordinary way of a lodger, about to leave a house, about the wedding that was to be held the following day. She had shown Mrs. Blanchard the pale grey silk gown, folded in a corner of her trunk, and had said, with a laugh that Mrs. Blanchard afterwards remembered, because it was the last laugh she would ever hear from her, that she would wear it in the morning, and hoped the weather would hold. Mrs. Blanchard had wished her joy of the day, and had helped her tie up her boxes with cord, and had sent a boy of the neighbourhood to fetch a handcart, on which the boxes would be carried to Carpenter's Buildings in the course of the afternoon. There is a photograph. No, there is not a photograph, and I keep almost saying that there is, because a modern listener wants a face. There is no picture of Mrs. Blanchard either, nor of the boy, nor of the trunk. The whole of it is words on a sheet of parish paper, and the words are few. What we have is Mrs. Blanchard's deposition, which runs to about a page, and which says that Hannah left her house at some little before 11, in a dark bonnet and a grey shawl, with a canvas bag over her shoulder, and that she said she would return by cab in the afternoon, to take away the last of her things, and that Mrs. Blanchard never saw her again. She was seen next by a woman who worked with her at a wash-house near the Green, at about 11:15 at the top of Camberwell Grove. This witness, whose name was Susan Field, spoke to Hannah for the space of some 5 minutes. Hannah told her, in the same easy way as she had spoken to Mrs. Blanchard, that she was going to Mr. Greenacre's rooms, that the two of them were to have a supper together that evening, and that his sister and 1 or 2 of his acquaintances were to be present, and that they would all go together in the morning to the parish church for the wedding. Susan Field wished her joy. Hannah walked on, up the grove, in the direction of Denmark Hill. 2 men and a woman with a child in her arms saw her at intervals along that walk. She was described afterwards as walking well, in no hurry, stopping once at a chandler's shop to buy, so the chandler afterwards told the police, a pennyworth of tallow candles and a paper of pins. She reached, at some little before noon, the top of Carpenter's buildings, which was then a short street of new-built terraced houses off the eastern side of Windsor Terrace, in the parish of Camberwell. She turned in at the door of number 6. She was seen going in by a boy who was cleaning a step at number 4. She was not seen coming out. The 2 of us must pause for a moment on the threshold of that door, because on the other side of it is the man who will be the reason for this whole telling, and I want you to meet him before he does what he does. James Greenacre was, in the winter of 1836, some 51 years of age, though he looked, by the accounts of those who knew him, younger by 5 or 6. He had been born in the county of Norfolk, in a village called Winterton, some little way inland from the sea, in the year 1785, or perhaps 1784. His father had been a farmer of small holdings. James had left the county in his young manhood, and had come up to London to be apprenticed, and had learned the trade of a cabinet maker, and had followed that trade, with breaks, for the whole of his life. He had been married 3 times before he met Hannah Brown. The first wife, a Norfolk girl, had died in her first childbed. A second, a widow of Bermondsey, had died some years after their marriage of what the papers of the day called a decline, meaning most likely a consumption. The third, whose name was Bramwell, had lived with him longest, and had borne him a son and a daughter, and had died in the year 1833, 3 years before the door at Carpenter's buildings opened for Hannah. In each of these bereavements, so far as the record goes, no shadow of doubt was ever cast on him. He was, in that respect, an ordinary widower of the labouring middle sort, of whom there were tens of thousands in the London of his day, since women died in childbed and men outlived them. He had also, and this is the piece of him that gives the case its particular strangeness, spent some 5 or 6 years in America. In the mid-1820s he had gone out, first to New York and then, so he later told a Newgate chaplain, to a settlement in the state of Ohio, where he had thought to buy land and set up as a farmer. That plan had failed. In the early 1830s he had come back to London by a route he did not much speak of, and had set up his cabinet-making again in the parish of Camberwell, and had done, by the accounts of his neighbours, tolerably well. At the time of his arrest he owned the freehold of 2 houses in the parish, on which he drew a rent, and the lease of his own house at Carpenter's buildings, and a tidy stock of tools, and a cabinet-maker's ledger, in which he entered his commissions in a hand that was, for a man of his sort, remarkably even and clear. In appearance he was of middling height, with a broad forehead and hair going grey at the temples, combed back from his face. His voice was low and, by the account of more than one witness, pleasant to hear. In speech he had lost the country accent of his boyhood, though he had never lost his taste for Norfolk turnip and Norfolk salt herring, which he had sent up to him by the mail coach in season. In the workshop he wore a leather apron over a plain shirt. On the street he wore a great coat with a velvet collar, of a cut that would have passed for that of a respectable tradesman in any parish of the town. Every man who was asked about him after his arrest, the churchwarden, the neighbour, the coal merchant, the man from whom he bought his timber, said the same thing in different words. He was, they said, a civil man. He kept his shop well. He paid his bills on the day they were due. I want to give you one gap here, because it is a real one and it matters. Nothing in the papers I have read, and nothing in the trial that came after tells us with certainty how James Greenacre and Hannah Brown had first come to know one another. The court accepted, on the word of a mutual acquaintance, that they had met some months before at a chapel in the district, and had walked out together in the ordinary way of a widower and a widow of middling age, and had by degrees come to an understanding. That is likely enough. It is not certain. Some of the papers of the day put in a story that they had met through the exchange of a piece of second-hand furniture, which is prettier and less likely. Others put in a story that the acquaintance who introduced them had done so with a view to a fee from Greenacre, which is uglier and, again, not proved. All we can say is that by the last week of November in 1836, the two of them had spoken to their friends of an intended marriage, and had named a day. Behind him in the rooms at Carpenter's Buildings, on the morning that Hannah walked up to his door, was a woman who was not Hannah. Her name was Sarah Gale. She was, at the time of these events, 32 years of age, and had been born in the parish of St. Luke's, in the north of the town, and had come south of the river in her 20s. By her was a child of some 3 or 4 years, a boy called George, and there was a story in her past that involved a marriage and a separation and a man who had gone away, one that the papers of the day gave up trying to pin down after the first fortnight. For the past year and a half she had been living with Greenacre. She kept his rooms. She cooked his meals. In the house she wore a print dress and a white apron, on the street a shawl and a bonnet of no particular fashion. By the accounts that survive she was reserved in manner, dark-haired, of middling height, and gave little away when she spoke. The plan of that household, in the weeks before Hannah came to the door, had been this. Greenacre had told Sarah Gale that he intended to marry Hannah Brown, that Hannah had property of her own, and that by the marriage he would come into a sum of money that would enable him to sell up his cabinet-making, take out passages for 3, and remove himself, Sarah, and the boy to America, where he had a mind to try his hand again at a farm. Sarah, so she afterwards said, had understood this plan. She had helped him prepare the rooms for Hannah's arrival. Her own things she had folded away into a single trunk. On 1 or 2 of the visits Hannah had made to the house in the days before Christmas, she had spoken to her in the manner of a woman making ready to leave. Hannah, for her part, had told her friends that Greenacre had property of his own, that he had lands in America to which they would go after the wedding, and that she would live, at last, as a woman who did not need to stand at a tub. What is not certain, and what has been argued over since the day of the trial to the present, is how much of what each of them told the other was true, and how much each of them knew, before that evening of the 24th of December, of the true state of the other's purse. What is certain is that on that evening, in the room at Carpenter's Buildings, with a fire burning in the grate, and a cabinet-maker's tools set out along the shelf, Hannah Brown was killed by a blow to the head, and that the man who dealt the blow was James Greenacre. I am going to leave the room itself, and what happened in it, for a later hour, because the story does not need me to open that door twice, and because it will be opened, in due course, in the level voice of the Chief Justice at the Old Bailey. What I want to give you now, before we close this hour, is what was seen and heard by the neighbours of Carpenter's Buildings that Christmas Eve, because it is little enough, and it is worth setting down. The woman at number 4 heard, at some little after 7 in the evening, a voice that she took for a woman's raised for a moment inside the house at number 6, and then the sound of a heavy object falling to the floor. She did not think much of it at the time. Number 6 was a cabinet-maker's house. Heavy objects fell to the floor there most days. The man at number 8 heard, at about 10 in the evening, the door of number 6 open, and Greenacre come out, and go up the street to a coal yard, and come back with what he took for a bundle of firewood over his shoulder. This too was not, in the hour, a thing to remark. The night was bitter, and Greenacre burned coal and wood together. No one in the street of Carpenter's Buildings on the evening of the 24th of December in the year 1836 heard anything that they took, at the time, to be the sound of a woman dying, or of the beginning of the work that would keep the man in the room busy until the early hours of Christmas Day. By the morning of the 25th, the wedding gown of pale grey silk was still folded in Hannah's trunk at Mrs. Blanchard's house, where Mrs. Blanchard, growing puzzled, sent the boy to Carpenter's Buildings to ask what should be done with it. The boy came back with word that Mrs. Brown was not there, and that Mr. Greenacre had said she had changed her mind and gone away. On Boxing Day, an omnibus driver on the new road toward Paddington later remembered a man in a greatcoat who had boarded his vehicle at the top of Camberwell with a heavy canvas bundle upon his knees, and who had ridden as far as the Edgware Road, and had got off at Pineapple Gate, and had walked away into the winter fog with the bundle held close against his chest. From that walk, and from other walks like it in the days that followed, came the pieces that a labourer named Bond had drawn out of the frost on the 28th. And from the door at Carpenter's Buildings, 6 weeks after all of it, the officers of the A Division, with a man at their head who answered to the name of Feltham, were now, at last, beginning to come. The Arrest by Candlelight. I'll write Chapter 7 now, keeping to the two-voice structure and the edgy 500-word target, and moving the case from Feltham's slow tracing through the parish to the arrest itself in the middle of the night at Kennington. Let us go forward now, you and I, from the door at Carpenter's Buildings on Christmas Eve to the door of another house on another street some 3 months later, because in the interval a great deal happened that the story cannot skip, and yet almost none of it happened in one place. It happened in the ledgers of pawnbrokers in 3 parishes. It happened in the memories of omnibus drivers along the new road. It happened in the notebook that Inspector Feltham of the A Division carried in the inside pocket of his coat, and that he took out 3 or 4 times a day in rooms and yards and cab stands from Camberwell to Paddington, and wrote a line in and put away again. By the middle of March in the year 1837, that notebook was almost full, and the man at the other end of its many lines had begun, without knowing it, to run out of days. Greenacre, in the weeks after Hannah Brown walked into his rooms and did not walk out, did not stay long at Carpenter's Buildings. Within a fortnight of Christmas, he had told the neighbours that he intended to give up the house, that he had commissions to complete elsewhere, and that he would remove himself and his household to another lodging in a healthier part of the parish. By the middle of January he was gone. He took with him Sarah Gale and her son George, who was, at that hour, 3 years and some months of age. He took with him a few tools of his trade, though he left the heavier bench behind. He took with him 3 trunks, of which the second, so a carter afterwards remembered, weighed more than a man could easily lift, and had to be swung onto the cart by 2 of them together, and had a rope drawn twice around its middle to hold the lid. He moved first to a set of rooms in Lambeth, and then, at the beginning of March, to the first floor of a house at No. 1, St. Albans Place, in the parish of Kennington, on a narrow street that ran off the Kennington Road not far from the toll gate. The rent was 6 shillings a week. The landlady, whose name was Mrs. Andrews, remembered him afterwards as a very steady lodger, who paid on the day, who kept his fire going late into the evening, and who had a way of running his thumb along the edge of a door frame as he passed through it, as though checking that the wood had been well planed. Sarah Gale she remembered as a woman who spoke little, and who did the marketing herself, and who kept the boy tidy. The child she remembered as fair-haired, thin in the face, and given to a cough in the mornings. You will have guessed by now, I think, that in these same weeks the officers of the A Division were coming, by their own road, toward the same door. Let me walk you along that road, because it is not the road that a modern reader expects. There were no forensic laboratories in London in the year 1837. There was no register of fingerprints. There was no photograph of any suspect anywhere in the town. There was not yet, in the full sense of the phrase, a detective branch at Scotland Yard, since the detective department would not be founded until the year 1842. What there was, in the A Division at Paddington, was 1 uniformed inspector, 2 sergeants, and something between 20 and 30 constables, who knew the streets of their parishes by name, who knew the pawnbrokers, and who could, when they were set to it, walk from door to door for weeks together and simply ask. Feltham set them to it. From the middle of February, when Gay first spoke Hannah Brown's name, he had his constables in every pawn shop from Marylebone Road to the Elephant, with a description of the pale grey silk gown, of a pair of pattens with iron rings, of a plain Bible with a name written on the flyleaf, and of half a dozen other small articles that Mrs. Blanchard, Hannah's landlady, had listed as being in her trunk on the 24th of December. 3 of these articles came back within a fortnight. A pawnbroker in the Waterloo Road remembered a woman who had brought in a Bible with a name he could not now read. A pawnbroker in the New Cut had taken in a pair of patterns with iron rings on a ticket made out in the name of Gale. A pawnbroker in a lane off the Kennington Road had taken in a pale grey silk gown, folded very neatly, on a ticket also made out in the name of Gale. The tickets themselves were kept at the shops. The goods were on the shelves. That was the moment, Feltham said afterwards, when he became sure of his man. Up to then he had suspected. From that hour he knew. 2 things, however, kept him from moving at once. The first was that he did not yet have Greenacre's new address, only a general sense that Greenacre had left Camberwell in the direction of the river. The second was that he wanted the tickets themselves in his hand before he knocked at any door, since a ticket in a pocket is worth a great deal more, in a court, than a description on a shelf. He set his constables to the second task and gave himself the first. I want to admit here, before I go on, that the record does not agree on every detail of these last weeks. One paper of the day said that Feltham had traced Greenacre to Kennington through an inquiry at a coal yard. Another said that a neighbour of Mrs. Andrews had spoken to a constable in the street. A third said that the pawnbroker in the Kennington Lane had recognised, in a description of the household given by the officer who fetched the ticket, the woman he had seen bring in the grey silk gown, and had said so. All of these may be true together, in the way that many small things often join to make one large thing certain. What is not in doubt is that by the evening of the 24th of March, Feltham had in his pocket the address of number 1, St. Albans Place, and had, in the drawer of his desk at Paddington, 3 pawn tickets in the name of Gale, and had made up his mind to go that night. We should be with him now, on that walk, because it is the last walk in this story that is anything like a peaceful one. He came out of the station house at some little after 10 in the evening. The night was cold, though not iron cold as December had been. A wind was coming up off the river from the south, and the paving stones were dark with a thin rain that had fallen earlier and had not dried. With him were 2 sergeants, whose names were Pegler and Chambers, and 4 constables, whose names have not all survived the record. They walked, not rode, from Paddington to Kennington, because Feltham held that horses on cobbles were a warning to any lodging he approached. The route took them down through the West End, across Westminster Bridge, and along the Kennington Road past the toll gate. They made no noise. They spoke very little. The lamps of the bridges laid long yellow lines on the black water of the Thames. They came to the top of St. Albans Place a little before midnight. Here Feltham divided them. He left 2 constables at the back of the house, in the yard behind, in case a window was tried. He left one at the front door of the neighbouring house, in case a party attempted the roof. He kept with himself Sergeant Pegler, 1 constable, and a locksmith of the neighbourhood, a Mr. Corner, whom he had woken and brought with him, against the chance that the front door would not open. Then he crossed the street, went up the 3 worn steps of number 1, and knocked, in the low, even way of a lodger returning late, 3 times upon the door. Mrs. Andrews came down in a shawl over her nightdress, with a candle held high in her hand. She opened the door on the chain. Feltham showed her his warrant, which she could not, in the poor light, read, and asked her, in a voice she afterwards described as courteous, whether Mr. Greenacre and Mrs. Gale were within. She said they were. She said they had gone up to bed at about 9:30. She said there was a child in the room with them, and asked, at once, whether it would be woken. Feltham said it need not be, if the parents came at once. She stood back and let him in. The house, on the inside, was of that ordinary sort you can still find, here and there, in the older streets of South London, though the plaster is different now and the gaslight has gone. A narrow hall with an oilcloth on the floor. A staircase of scrubbed pine, without a carpet. A smell of coal smoke and boiled washing that had not quite been let out. On the wall of the hall a print of the young Queen, whose reign was only 9 months off from beginning, and who was, at that hour, still a princess in Kensington Palace. Feltham took off his hat as he came in. So, at his glance, did the sergeant and the constable behind him. Mrs. Andrews led the way up the stairs with her candle held before her, and Feltham followed, and the men followed him, and none of the boards creaked more than could be helped. At the first landing she stopped and pointed to a door. She whispered that the family were within, that the boy slept on a mattress at the foot of the parents' bed, and that if Feltham would be so good as to give her a moment, she would say a word first, so that Sarah, whom she called by her Christian name, might rise and put on a wrap before he entered. Feltham thanked her, but said that would not do. He asked her to stand back at the head of the stairs. He put his own hand to the door, and, finding it not bolted, pushed it open and went in. Inside the room a fire had burnt down to a red mass in the grate, and the only other light was the candle Mrs. Andrews had left on the landing. As Feltham's eyes adjusted, he saw a bed against the far wall, and in it 2 figures under a blanket, and on the floor at the foot of the bed a low mattress with a child upon it, curled on his side, one hand under his cheek. Greenacre sat up first. His hair was rumpled from the pillow. He asked, in a voice thick with sleep, what the meaning was. Feltham said his name aloud, and his own name, and the words, "I have a warrant for your arrest for the murder of Hannah Brown." Sarah Gale sat up beside him, drew the blanket up to her shoulders, and did not speak. There was, by every account, no struggle. Greenacre swung his legs out of the bed and put his hand up to his eyes. He said, at length, that he had been expecting them, though he did not say for how long. He asked whether he might dress. Feltham said he might, in the presence of the constable, but that he might not go near the fireplace, nor the trunk under the window, nor the drawer of the small bureau by the door. Greenacre said he had no wish to. He dressed, in a shirt and a waistcoat and a pair of trousers that were folded on a chair, in the manner of a man who had folded them himself the night before. Sarah Gale asked, in a low voice, whether the boy might be left with Mrs. Andrews. Feltham said he might, for the present, but that a woman of the parish would be sent in the morning to take him to the workhouse for safe-keeping until the case was known. The boy, through all of this, did not wake. While Greenacre dressed, Sergeant Pegler, with the constable, began the search of the room. Under the bed they found a canvas bag containing a hammer, a chisel, and 2 lengths of new rope. In the trunk under the window they found a set of men's clothes marked with the letters J.G., and, at the bottom of the trunk, folded into a linen shift, a Bible with the name Hannah Brown, written on the flyleaf in a hand not her own. In the drawer of the bureau by the door they found some £3 in coin, a set of shipping papers made out in the name of Greenacre, 3 passages booked on a barque called the Robinson, which was to sail from the port of London on the 3rd of April for the port of New York, and a leather pocket-book. When Pegler opened the pocket-book, he found within it a folded piece of paper, and within that 3 pawn tickets in the name of Gale, for a Bible, a pair of pattens with iron rings, and a pale grey silk gown, at 3 shops in 3 parishes. Sarah Gale, sitting up in the bed with the blanket at her shoulders, watched Pegler unfold the paper and take out the tickets, and said nothing. Feltham said afterwards that she did not weep. She did not exclaim. She turned her face, very slightly, toward the wall, and closed her eyes, in the manner of a person shutting out a light that has become too bright to bear. Greenacre, buttoning his waistcoat by the door, saw what Pegler held in his hand, and looked at the floor for the space of some seconds, and then went on buttoning his waistcoat, as though he had not seen it at all. They left the house at some little after 1 in the morning of the 25th of March. 2 hackneys had been fetched from the stand at the top of the Kennington Road. In the first, Feltham rode with Greenacre and 1 constable. In the second, Sergeant Pegler rode with Sarah Gale and another. The boy, George, was left asleep on his mattress under the care of Mrs. Andrews, who sat by him in her shawl and waited for the morning. The trunk, the canvas bag, the shipping papers, and the leather pocket-book with the 3 pawn tickets were carried down by the other constables and taken away in a 3rd cab that had been fetched from the same stand. I will say one honest thing before I let this hour close. The record does not tell us what Sarah Gale thought, as her cab rolled north across Westminster Bridge in the dark, with the Black River running under her and the man she had lived with sitting in another cab in front. It does not tell us what Greenacre thought either. Both of them, in the weeks that followed, would speak and write a great deal, and much of what they said would contradict much of what the other said, and some of what each said would contradict what each had said the day before. What we can say for certain is only what the constables saw. In the first cab, Greenacre sat upright, with his hands folded in his lap, and looked straight ahead through the small square window at the road. In the second cab, Sarah Gale sat with her face turned to the leather side of the seat and did not once look out. They came to the station house at Paddington at some little before 3 in the morning. Greenacre was taken through to the front room and formally charged. Sarah Gale was taken through to a separate room and charged as an accessory. Both were then removed, under escort, to the house of detention at Clerkenwell, to be held there until the sitting of the coroner's court that would commit them to Newgate for trial. The trunk and its contents were logged, item by item, into a book by a sergeant with a bad cold and a slow hand. The 3 pawn tickets, laid out flat on the desk, were docketed with a number and placed inside an envelope, sealed, and put into the drawer that Feltham had kept for the case since the 7th of February. The drawer was locked. The candle was blown out. Somewhere in the town, though he did not know it yet, a Chief Justice was asleep in his bed, and in the morning the papers would carry, in the largest type they could set, the news that at last the Edgware Road Horror had names to it, and a place, and, before very long, a court. The Old Bailey in April. The 6 weeks between the arrest at St Albans Place and the opening of the trial at the Old Bailey were, in the manner of such weeks in London, both very long and very short. Long for the 2 prisoners on the men's and women's sides of Newgate, who counted their hours by the ringing of St Sepulchre's bell across the street. Short for the newspaper men of Fleet Street, who had a case to fill their columns with, day after day, until the wheels of the presses seemed to run on the pawn tickets, the rope, and the shipping papers for the bark Robinson that had sailed for New York without her passengers. The Old Bailey of that year was not the round-domed building a listener today might picture. That court would not be built until the closing years of the century. What stood on the site then was the Sessions House, a plain stone building of 2 stories, joined by a covered passage to the debtors' door of Newgate Prison next door. Sessions were held 8 times a year. When the papers spoke of the Central Criminal Court, this was what they meant. When they spoke of a prisoner being brought over from Newgate, they meant a walk of perhaps 60 paces along that inner corridor, from the condemned yard past the kitchen and into a low anteroom at the back of the court, where the accused waited on a bench until called up the wooden steps into the dock. I want you to see the inside of that court for a moment, because it is not the court you will have seen in any print. The room was rectangular, low-ceilinged, panelled in oak that had been polished so many times, and for so long, that it took the pale light of the tall windows and threw it back in a dull glow, as though the wood itself were burning at a low heat. At the far end, on a raised bench, sat the judges. Behind them, on the wall, the royal arms in painted plaster. To their right, the jury box. To their left, the counsel's table, piled with papers tied in pink tape. In front of them, and separated from them by the well of the court, the dock, a wooden enclosure, waist-high, with a rail across the top and a mirror set into the ceiling above at an angle, so that the reflected daylight fell full on the faces of the accused and let the judges read them. It is a small thing, that mirror. It is one of the most terrible things in the whole building. The trial opened on the morning of Monday, the 10th of April, in the year 1837. The papers of the day agreed that the crowd outside had begun to gather by 4 in the morning, in a drizzling rain that turned the paving of the street to a slick black mirror of its own. By the time the doors were opened at 8, the passage from Ludgate Hill to Snow Hill was blocked with people, in such a press that the constables of the city had to clear a lane for the gowns of the council to walk through. Tickets to the gallery had been sold, quietly, by an underkeeper of the prison, for as much as £5 a seat, which was more than a working man of that year earned in 6 weeks. The judge who sat that morning was Sir Nicholas Conyngham Tyndall, Lord Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas, a Cambridgeshire man of 60 years, mild in voice, careful in phrasing, and known at the bar for a manner so courteous that the young men who first appeared before him were sometimes surprised to find, on reading the verdict, how firmly they had lost. Beside him on the bench sat Mr. Baron Alderson and the Common Sergeant of the city. The Attorney-General, Sir John Campbell, led for the Crown, with Mr. Bodkin as his junior. For Greenacre appeared a Mr. Price and a Mr. Payne. For Sarah Gale, a Mr. Ballantyne, then a young man of the Inner Temple, who would go on, in later years, to become one of the great trial advocates of the age, but who on that April morning was defending, upon his second brief in a capital case, a woman he had never met before that week. Greenacre came up the steps into the dock at a little after 9. He wore a black coat and a dark waistcoat, and had shaved himself carefully that morning. His hair, greyer at the temples than it had been at Christmas, was combed back from his forehead. He bowed to the bench. Sarah Gale came up the steps behind him. She was in the same dark bonnet and shawl she had worn at the committal, and her face under the wide brim was very pale, and she held her hands folded at her waist, and did not once look at the man beside her. The clerk of the court read out the indictment, that on the 24th of December in the year 1836, at the parish of Camberwell, they had murdered Hannah Brown, and had afterwards cut up her body, and had cast the parts of it into public places. Both prisoners were asked how they pleaded. Both said, in low voices, "Not guilty." We must skip past the first 2 hours, in which the jury was sworn and the case was opened, and come with me straight to the witnesses, because it is in the witnesses that the whole of the story we have been telling is set out again from the beginning, in the level roomlight of a court, by voices that had, until then, spoken only to constables in kitchens and yards. Mrs. Blanchard, the landlady at Union Street, came first, in a black dress with a white collar, and told the court what she had told the officers in February, that Hannah, her lodger, had left her house at some little before 11 on the morning of Christmas Eve, in a dark bonnet and grey shawl, with a canvas bag over her shoulder, and had said she would return in the afternoon, and had never done so. She spoke without weeping. She had done her weeping already. Susan Field, the wash-house woman from the top of Camberwell Grove, followed her and set out the meeting on the pavement at 11:15. Then the chandler with the paper of pins. Then the boy who had been cleaning the step at number 4 Carpenter's buildings, who was made to stand on a wooden box behind the witness rail so that his head might clear it, and who spoke so faintly that Chief Justice Tyndall asked him twice to raise his voice, and who did, and who then said, in the flat speech of a boy of 9, that he had seen the lady go in at number 6 a little before noon on the day before Christmas Day, and had not seen her come out. The medical evidence came next, and took the whole of the afternoon of the first day. Girdwood, the police surgeon at Paddington, whose lamp had burned so long over the frozen head at the workhouse, gave his account of the torso at Pineapple Gate, and the head at Ben Jonson's lock, and how he had matched the neck of the one to the severed neck of the other by the shape of the cut and the fit of the bone. He gave his account of the limbs from the ditch at Coldharbour Lane. He gave his account of the tooth. There was at the front of the woman's mouth a broken tooth, with the break fresh, and a small wound on the inside of the cheek behind it, as though the tooth had been driven inward by a blow. He set the whole of it out in the manner of a man giving evidence about a piece of joinery, without a word of feeling, because feeling was not his part of the room. Chief Justice Tyndall thanked him. The gallery was hushed. I ought to say here, and I want to say it plainly, that the record of what passed between Girdwood and the defence on that afternoon has come down to us in 3 different newspaper reports, and no 2 of them agree in every particular. Some passages that one paper prints are missing from another. In one report, the defence puts a long series of questions about the exact hour of death, which no surgeon of that year could have answered with any usefulness. In another, those questions are not there at all. Where I do not know, I shall not pretend to. What is not in doubt is the sum of the medical evidence, that the woman had been struck a heavy blow to the head while living, that she had died of it, and that the dismemberment had been done after death with an ordinary saw and an ordinary knife by a hand that knew how to use both. The second day was the day of the omnibus drivers and the pawnbrokers. 3 drivers came in, one after the other, and each told a small piece of the same story. One had carried, on Boxing Day, a man in a greatcoat with a heavy canvas bundle on his knees, from the top of Camberwell as far as the Edgware Road, and had watched him step off at Pineapple Gate and walk away into the fog with the bundle held against his chest. Another had carried, on the 3rd of January, a man of the same description, with a bundle again, on the new road towards Stepney, who had left the omnibus at the top of Commercial Road and had walked east. The third had carried, on some day in the middle of January that he could not now fix, a man with a canvas sack on his knees, and had thought nothing of it at the time, because sacks on knees were an ordinary sight in a London omnibus. All 3, when Greenacre was asked to stand up in the dock and to turn his head first one way and then the other, said quietly that he was the man. Then the pawnbrokers came, with their tickets and their books, and Inspector Feltham himself in the box, with the notebook from his coat pocket, and, at the end of it, laid out on a piece of green baize on the council's table, the hammer, the chisel, the 2 lengths of new rope, the Bible with Hannah's name in a hand not her own, the pale grey silk wedding gown folded very neatly, and the 3 shipping papers for the bark Robinson, in the names of Greenacre, Gale, and 1 child. It is one thing to hear that such objects were found. It is another, I think, to sit for a moment with what it must have been to see them side by side on a table in a courtroom in April, a hammer and a wedding gown, no more than a hand's breadth apart. The defence, when it came, was a strange one, and it is worth setting down as it was made, because it has shaped what has been written about Greenacre ever since. Greenacre, through his counsel, did not deny that the body was Hannah Brown's. He did not deny that he had cut her up. He did not deny that he had carried her, in pieces, across the sleeping city on omnibuses and by hand. What he denied was that he had murdered her. His account was this. There had been, that evening at Carpenter's buildings, a quarrel. Hannah had, he said, boasted to him for weeks of properties in America and of savings in a Camberwell bank, and he had discovered, in the course of the day, that neither the properties nor the savings existed. Words had passed. He had been sitting in one chair, she in another, and, in a moment of temper, he had tipped her chair backwards with his foot, meaning only to give her a fright, and she had struck her head upon the floor and had died within the hour, without speaking again. Fearing, he said, that he would not be believed, and remembering the deaths of his 3 wives which had already, so he said, been the subject of unkind talk in the parish, he had chosen to conceal what had happened, rather than call the beadle. That was his defence in the whole of it, and he did not go into the box himself to put it, since prisoners in England did not yet have the right to give sworn evidence in their own trials, a right that would not be granted until the year 1898, more than 60 years after he stood in the dock. Chief Justice Tyndall summed up on the afternoon of the 3rd day. He set out, in a voice that carried without any sharpness, the whole of the evidence, and he laid before the jury the difference between an unlawful killing that was manslaughter and one that was murder, and he asked them to consider whether a man who tipped a chair backwards in temper could reasonably be said to have foreseen the death of the person in it, and whether, if they thought he could, the concealment that had followed was consistent with the story of a frightened man, or with the story of one who had done a thing he had meant to do. He commended Sarah Gale's case to them separately, and reminded them that she stood charged as an accessory after the fact, and that the question in her case was not whether she had struck the blow, which no one said she had, but whether she had, knowing what had been done, helped in the hiding of it, in the folding away of a wedding gown, in the pawning of a Bible, in the packing of 3 trunks for a passage across the ocean. The jury retired at a little after 4 in the afternoon. They were out for 15 minutes. They returned. The foreman rose. He said, in a plain voice, that they found James Greenacre guilty of murder and Sarah Gale guilty as an accessory after the fact. Chief Justice Tyndall put on the black cap. It is a piece of cloth of a particular sort, folded square and laid over the wig. He passed sentence upon Greenacre in the form of words which had been passed upon the condemned in England for some 300 years, that he be taken hence to the prison from which he came, and thence to the place of execution, and there hanged by the neck until his body was dead, and that his body afterwards be buried within the precincts of the prison, and might the Lord have mercy on his soul. Greenacre bowed. He said, in a voice that was heard at the back of the gallery, "My lord, I have nothing to say." Sarah Gale, upon a separate address by the Chief Justice, was sentenced to be transported beyond the seas for the term of her natural life. She did not bow. She did not speak. She was led down the steps from the dock and out along the covered corridor and back into Newgate on the women's side. Greenacre was led down after her and along the same corridor and turned aside at the door of the condemned yard and taken through and up a narrow flight of stone stairs to the cell that had been prepared for him on the day the trial began, and in which, for the last weeks of his life, he would write and pray and make his confessions and unmake them, while outside the walls of the prison, in the yards of the printers of Seven Dials, the ballad sellers were already setting into type the verses that would be sung by the crowd at his hanging. The condemned cell at Newgate. Let me get to work on Chapter 9. We must go with him now, you and I, out of the courtroom and along that covered passage, because the walk between the Sessions House and the condemned yard at Newgate is one of the shortest walks in this whole story, and one of the ones that changes the most. 60 paces, no more, of stone corridor lit by a lamp at either end. A door at the far side, iron-bound. The turnkey standing to attention. The scrape of the bolt drawing back, and a man who at 9 in the morning had been a prisoner on trial and might yet, in the imagination, be an ordinary man again, becomes, in the space of a minute's walk, a prisoner under sentence, whose remaining days can be counted upon the fingers of 2 hands. The condemned cell at Newgate, in the spring of the year 1837, stood in the north-eastern corner of the men's side of the prison, on the ground floor, off the yard that the keepers called press yard, though the pressing of prisoners under stones had ceased there almost a century before. The cell itself was a stone room some 9 feet long by 7 feet wide, with a barrel-vaulted ceiling of blackened brick, a single high window fitted with 3 bars set close, and a plank bed clamped by iron to the wall. There was a stool. There was a small deal table. There was, above the door, a hasp for the lamp that burned through the night. There was nothing else. The floor was stone, worn in a shallow dish before the door, by the pacing of the men who had stood in that room before him, and who had, at last, been fetched from it, and led along another short passage to the platform outside the debtors' door. Greenacre came into that room on the afternoon of the 12th of April in the year 1837, at some little after 5 o'clock. 2 turnkeys walked with him. A third had gone before to open the door. He was still in the black coat and the dark waistcoat he had worn in the dock, though the coat had by now the flat, creased look that clothes take on when a man has been sitting in them for the whole of a long day. He was permitted to keep his shirt, his stockings, and his shoes. His pocket-book, his knife, and the small silver watch that he had carried into court that morning were taken from him and entered in a book at the lodge. The turnkeys withdrew. The door was closed and bolted. The lamp above the door was lit and left burning. The high window showed a square of pale London sky, in which, if he stood on his stool, he could see, above the parapet of a wall, the tops of the chimneys of a printer's yard in Giltspur Street. Newgate at that hour was not the ruinous shell it would later be called. It had been rebuilt after the Gordon riots of 1780, was less than 60 years old, and by the standards of the day was thought a well-run prison. There was a chapel within the walls, and a chaplain who lived on the premises, whose title was the Ordinary of Newgate, and whose duty it was to attend the condemned in the last 3 weeks of their lives. There was an under-sheriff of the city who visited daily. There was a matron on the women's side, and a keeper, and a governor, and a physician who came in twice a week. There was, in short, a very great deal of order laid over what was, in the plain fact of it, the killing of men and women by rope in a public street. The order did not lessen the killing. It only made it easier to write down in a book at the end of the day. The ordinary of Newgate in the spring of that year was the Reverend Horace Cotton, a man of some years and long service, who had attended the condemned in that same cell since before the death of King George III. He came to Greenacre on the morning of the 13th of April, sat with him for the space of an hour, opened a small pocket Bible, and read to him from the Gospel of St. John. He came again the next day, and the day after, and after that every morning until the day of Greenacre's death. It was he who wrote down, in his own hand, in the ordinary's account that was kept at Newgate for such purposes, the substance of what the prisoner said to him in those weeks. His account has been printed since. Some of what it contains I believe, some of it I do not, and I will say plainly which is which. I want to stop here for a moment and say something honest before I let the days at Newgate go on. The record we have of James Greenacre's last weeks of life is a strange record. Some of it is in the ordinary's account. Some of it is in the newspapers, which printed almost daily paragraphs headed by the words, "The Convict Greenacre." Some of it is in the letters that Greenacre himself wrote from the cell, of which perhaps a dozen survive. Some of it is in the report of the under-sheriff, Mr. Wantner, who visited him more than once. These accounts do not agree. In some of them Greenacre is calm, in others agitated. In some he weeps, in others he does not. In some he confesses fully, in others he holds to the story of the tipped chair he gave in court. What I can offer you is not one Greenacre, but the man who moves between these versions of himself, and who, in the space of 20 days between his sentence and his hanging, cannot seem to hold to any single account for very long. He wrote, from the very first, a great deal. Paper and ink were permitted him, in ordinary quantity, on the condition that everything he wrote was read by the governor before it left the prison. In the first week he wrote 3 letters to Sarah Gale, on the women's side of the same building, no more than 100 yards from him, and yet as far as the moon. Only one of these letters was allowed to be delivered. The other 2 were kept back by the governor as containing matter that might unsettle her mind, though what precisely was in them we do not know, as they were burnt after his death. The one that reached her, and which was afterwards printed in the Morning Herald, was a short letter of some 400 words, in which he asked her to forgive him for the ruin he had brought upon her, and to look for their child, George, wherever the parish might place him, and to remember that whatever he had been done by his own hand and not by hers. Sarah, when she read it, in the ward of the women's felons at the far side of the yard, is said by the matron to have folded it very carefully, put it inside her Bible, and made no other reply. She was, by this date, waiting to be moved to the hulks at Woolwich, and from there to the female convict ship Elizabeth and Henry, which was to sail in July for New South Wales. The boy George, we know, had been taken by the parish overseers of Kennington from Mrs. Andrews's house on the morning after the arrest, and had been placed in the workhouse of the parish of St. Mary Newington, where the register lists him as 3 years of age, of the surname Gale, and in good health. What became of him after the year 1840 is not certain. There is a George Gale, of Kennington, who appears in a school list of the year 1841, in a class of pauper boys being taught to read and to make shoes. Whether it is the same child is one of the many things about this case that the record does not settle. Greenacre also wrote, in the second week, a long paper which he called in his own hand at the top, An Account of My Life and Habits. It ran to some 14 pages, and was intended, so he told the ordinary, for publication after his death, in the belief that the proceeds might be given to Sarah Gale. This account has come down to us, though in a form that has plainly been edited. In it he set out his childhood in the parish of Winkley in Devon, the death of his father a farmer, his coming to London at the age of 16, his apprenticeship to a cabinet maker in Aldersgate Street, his marriage to his first wife, the deaths, one after another, of that wife and of 2 further wives, and the long years in which he had traded in furniture, in soap, in a patent washing machine of his own invention, and had lived, at various dates in Camberwell, in Bermondsey, in Woolwich, and in the parish of Bethnal Green. Of Hannah Brown, in that same paper, he wrote very little. He said that he had met her in the autumn of the year 1836 through the introduction of her brother, that he had believed her to be a woman of some little property, that she had believed him to be a man of some little property, and that both of them had been mistaken. He said that on the evening of the 24th of December there had been between them a quarrel of the ordinary sort, in which words had been used that ought not to have been used, and that the death that followed had been an accident and not a purpose. He said nothing of the pawn tickets. He said nothing of the shipping papers for the bark Robinson. He said nothing of the omnibus rides. The ordinary, sitting with him on the mornings that followed, pressed him, in the gentle, careful way of a clergyman who has done this many times before, to speak of those omissions. Greenacre, at first, would not. On the 17th of April he said he would not add anything to what he had already written. On the 20th he said he had already told all that he intended to tell. On the 24th, 10 days into his sentence, he wept for the first time. On the 26th, in a long conversation of which the ordinary made notes at the door of the cell as soon as he came out, Greenacre said that he had, in fact, struck Hannah Brown with a piece of wood, a piece of an old table leg that had been by his hand at the moment of the quarrel, and that he had struck her not once but twice, and that the second blow had been struck when she was already on the floor. He said this, and then, on the 27th, he retracted it, and said the ordinary had misheard him, and that the story of the tipped chair, as he had given it in court, was the true one. I do not think we shall ever know, at this distance, which of these accounts is nearer to what happened on that evening at Carpenter's Buildings. Both are on the record. Both were said by the same mouth. The medical evidence, insofar as a police surgeon of that year could speak to it, favoured a heavy blow rather than a fall. But the medical evidence of 1837 is not the medical evidence of a later century, and even the surgeon Girdwood, who was not a hesitant man, would not put the point beyond argument. What is not in doubt is that Hannah Brown died in that room, and that her killing, whatever its precise mechanism, was not the sort of thing that any ordinary quarrel is expected to leave behind. Let us step for a moment out of the cell, you and I, and go outside the walls, because the days of Greenacre's condemnation were not lived only inside Newgate. Outside, in the streets of the city and in the yards of the printers of 7 Dials, another kind of production was already in motion. The ballad sellers of London, whose trade was to set into rough verse the crimes of the moment and to sell them, at a penny a sheet, on the day of the hanging, had begun to work upon Greenacre's case within a week of the sentence. There survive, in the collections of that time, at least 7 different ballads on the Edgware Road Horror, printed by at least 4 different presses, in 7 Dials, in Aldgate, in the Borough, and in Shoreditch. Some are set to the tune of an older ballad about a poisoner. Some are set to the tune of a hymn. All of them have the same shape. They tell, in some 12 or 16 4-line verses, the story of a widower who deceived a washerwoman, killed her in his rooms upon the eve of their wedding, cut up her body, and was at length caught and brought to Newgate to die. None of these ballads is accurate in every particular. Some have Hannah Brown as a young woman of 22, when she was in fact 47. Some have the killing done with a knife, when it was done with something blunter. Some have Greenacre going to New York in disguise and being brought back in chains, which did not happen. But the truth of them, in the wider sense, was true enough, and the singers on the corners of the streets in the week before the execution knew what they were selling. They sold in that week some tens of thousands of sheets, at a penny each, in a city where a penny would buy a piece of bread. It was, for the ballad trade, a very good spring. Inside the cell, on the last morning of April, Greenacre asked the ordinary a question that the ordinary afterwards recorded. He asked whether it would be permitted, on the morning of his death, for a piece of black cloth to be tied over his eyes before he was brought out onto the platform. The ordinary said that this was not customary, but that he would put the request to the under-sheriff. The under-sheriff, Mr. Wantner, on receiving the request, gave his consent. The hangman, Mr. Calcraft, who lived at that date in a small house in Hoxton, and who had been the executioner at Newgate since the year 1829, was informed. On the morning of the 1st of May, the day before he was to die, Greenacre was permitted to write 2 more letters, one to his sister in Devon, and one to a dissenting minister of Bermondsey who had known him in his younger days. Both were sent. Neither has survived. That evening, the 1st of May, the ordinary sat with him in the cell for 2 hours. What passed between them is not fully recorded, though the ordinary wrote, in the margin of his account, that the prisoner was composed and that he prayed, at the end of it, in a low voice, for his own soul and for the soul of Hannah Brown. The lamp above the door was lit. The high window showed the square of London sky, darkening from grey to a deep flat blue. Somewhere in the yard beyond, the sound could be heard of a hammer striking on a nail, and then again, at regular intervals, as the carpenters set up, in the small hours between night and morning, the black wooden platform that would stand in the street outside the Debtors' door at 8 o'clock the following day. The crowd at the Debtors' door. The night between the 1st and 2nd of May in the year 1837 was warm for the season. A listener today would call it mild. The Londoners of that year, who had spent the winter in a cold that froze the Regent's Canal from bank to bank, called it the first true spring night, and they came out into it in numbers that had not been seen in the streets around Newgate since the hanging of the Cato Street conspirators 17 years before. By 10 o'clock in the evening, the corner of Old Bailey and Newgate Street was already thick with people. By midnight, the press reached back as far as Ludgate Hill and forward as far as Snow Hill, and the constables of the city, in their tall hats and their long coats, had begun to link arms across the mouths of the side lanes and to turn back the carriages that tried to come through. I want to stop with you here, before the scaffold goes up, and say something plain about what a public hanging in London meant in that year, because a listener now cannot easily picture it, and the papers of the day did not always try. A hanging outside Newgate was not thought a private matter. It was thought a public act, done in the sight of the people, in the middle of a working street, upon a platform that was assembled in the open air the night before. Children were brought to it. Women were brought to it. Windows in the houses opposite the prison were let out for the morning, at prices that ran, at the higher end of the case, to 5 guineas a seat, which was more than 3 months' wages for a housemaid in service. The windows of the Magpie and Stump, the public house on the corner directly opposite the Debtors' door, had been let a week in advance. So had the windows of the shop next to it, which sold hats. So had the windows above the printer's yard at the further end of the street. Everything with a view had been let, and the letting of it was a trade like any other, and nobody in the parish of St. Sepulchre thought it strange. The scaffold itself was raised between 2 and 4 in the morning by 3 carpenters and their 2 apprentices, working under the light of pitch torches that were driven into the paving stones at the corners of the platform. The platform stood some 8 feet high, framed in oak, floored with pine planks, hung all round on 3 sides with a curtain of black baize. It was set flush against the outer wall of the prison, at the door that the keepers called the Debtors' door, though no debtor had been hanged from it in living memory. Above the platform, at the height of a man's head when he stood upon it, ran the crossbeam of a single piece of oak from which the rope would hang. The trapdoor beneath, some 6 feet by 3, was hinged to fall inward when the bolt was drawn, and the drop below it into the space behind the black baize curtain was set at 18 inches, which was the drop that Mr. Calcraft, the hangman, was in the habit of using in almost every case he attended, and which, as more than one writer of that century afterwards observed, was not enough to break the necks of the men and women he was paid to kill. Death by that drop was by slow strangulation. It was known to be so. It was permitted to be so. Greenacre woke, in the condemned cell, at a little past 5 o'clock in the morning of the 2nd of May. He had slept, so the turnkey on the outer bench afterwards told a reporter from the Weekly Chronicle, for perhaps 3 hours in the whole of the night, and had spent the rest of it either in prayer with the ordinary or in writing at the deal table by the lamp above the door. What he wrote in those last hours we do not have. The ordinary took his final letters at some time before 6 and passed them to the governor at the lodge, and there the paper trail of James Greenacre's own words ends. The governor is thought to have burnt them within the week. Whether he did so under orders or of his own judgment or in the belief that the family in Devon would not wish to see them, I do not know, and I will not guess. The record on the point is silent. He was brought his breakfast at 6:30. It was the standard breakfast of the condemned yard, which was bread and butter and a small pot of tea. He ate the bread. He drank the tea. He left the butter untouched. At 7 o'clock the ordinary came to him for the last time, and read to him from the burial service of the Church of England, which is the office read for the dead, but which was, by custom, read to the condemned upon the morning of their execution. Greenacre listened with his head bowed. When it was ended, he stood up from the plank bed and permitted himself to be dressed. He was given a plain white shirt without a collar, and dark trousers, and slippers of soft leather, and a black cravat which was tied loose at the throat rather than knotted, because a knotted cravat would have to be cut away by the hangman on the platform, and the tying of it loose was a courtesy that Mr. Calcraft asked of every prisoner he attended. At a little before 8, the procession formed at the door of the cell. The under-sheriff, Mr. Wantner, in his robe and his chain of office, went first. 2 turnkeys followed him. Then the ordinary. Then Greenacre, walking between 2 more turnkeys, unbound as yet, his hands folded before him. The procession moved along the corridor of the condemned yard, and out into the open air of the yard itself, and across the yard to the door at the far end that gave onto the passage that led up to the scaffold. At the door of the passage, in a room some 10 feet square, they halted. Mr. Calcraft was waiting for them. He was a stout man of 45, dressed in a black frock coat and dark breeches, with a face that had settled, over many years of this trade, into a look of no expression at all. He bowed to the under-sheriff. He bowed to the ordinary. He came forward and bound Greenacre's hands at the wrist, in front of him, with a leather strap. He passed the noose of the rope over his head and drew it down to the throat, and settled the knot beneath the left ear, which was where he was in the habit of setting it. He drew from his pocket the piece of black cloth that had been prepared, at the prisoner's own request the day before, and tied it over his eyes. Let me pause here, one last time, because I have been in the room with this man for 2 chapters now, and I owe you a word about him before we go out into the street. James Greenacre was not, I think, an ordinary murderer, if any of them can be called ordinary. He was a man who had lived for most of a life of 52 years within the ordinary bounds of the trades of London, an apprentice, a cabinet-maker, a small tradesman in soap and in furniture, a widower 3 times over, a father of children, some of whom had died and some of whom had not. He was known to his neighbours as a mild man, of no temper in company, a keeper of accounts, a Sunday chapel-goer. And yet, on the evening of the 24th of December in the year 1836, in a set of rooms at Carpenter's buildings in Camberwell, he had killed a washerwoman of 47, named Hannah Brown, who had come to him in her wedding shawl with a canvas bag over her shoulder, and had then cut her body into 3 pieces and carried them, over the course of the 12 days that followed, across the sleeping city on the tops of omnibuses and in the folds of a greatcoat. Whatever a listener wishes to make of the man who did that, and there have been many verdicts on him since, is a matter for the listener. What the record is clear on is what he did, and what the law of that year did to him for it, and it is with the second of those, now, that we have to be. The bell of St. Sepulchre's began to toll at 10 minutes before 8. It was the bell that had tolled for the condemned of Newgate for 200 years by then. Its sound reached, over the rooftops of the city, as far as the river, and the crowd in the street outside, which had grown by that hour to a number the papers set at 20,000, and which some later writers have put as high as 25, fell into a low murmur that carried its own weight in the morning air. The door at the top of the passage was drawn back. The under-sheriff stepped out onto the platform. The ordinary followed. Then Greenacre, on the arm of the turnkey at his right, with Mr. Calcraft at his left, walked out into the daylight for the last time in his life. The murmur of the crowd rose for a moment, in the way of crowds, and then subsided. The bell tolled on. He was placed upon the trapdoor. The rope, which had been made fast to the beam the night before, was drawn up until it stood taut above his head. He was asked, by the ordinary, whether he had anything to say. He did not answer. The ordinary read, in a voice that was heard by those in the front row of the crowd but not by those further back, a short prayer of commendation. Mr. Calcraft stepped to the lever at the side of the platform, laid his hand on it, waited for the ordinary to end, and drew it back. The trapdoor fell. The rope tightened. The crowd made a sound that the reporter for the Times described only as a sound, without giving it a name. He did not die at once. He did not, in fact, die for some minutes. The drop was not deep enough to break his neck, as it was not deep enough in almost any case that Mr. Calcraft attended, and Greenacre died of strangulation, in full view of the crowd, in a manner that was, I will not describe further than to say that it was the manner in which most of the men and women hanged at Newgate in that decade died, and which was in later years one of the reasons that the practice of hanging in public in England was at length brought to an end, though the ending would not come for another 31 years. In the year 1868, long after the platform outside the Debtors' door had ceased to be raised for James Greenacre, or for any other, his body was left hanging for an hour, as was the custom. At 9 o'clock it was cut down, taken through the door in the wall, and carried into the prison, where it was laid on a table in a small room off the yard, and where, in the manner directed by the Anatomy Act of 5 years before, it was later that day removed for dissection to the theatre of the College of Surgeons in Lincoln's Inn Fields. What was done with it there is on the register of the college. What remained of it, after a fashion, was interred within the precincts of Newgate. There is no grave marker. The register lists a plot number. The plot itself is under the paving of what is now a courtyard of the Central Criminal Court. Sarah Gale, on the women's side of the same building, was still asleep at the hour of the drop, or was permitted by the matron to appear so, which comes to the same thing in the record. She was moved to the hulks at Woolwich in the second week of May, and from there, upon the 12th of July of that year, she was put aboard the female convict ship Elizabeth and Henry, which sailed for New South Wales on the 14th. The ship arrived at Sydney Cove upon the 23rd of November, after a passage of 132 days. She was assigned as a servant to a settler at Parramatta. She married again, in the year 1844, a former convict of the same district. She had 2 further children. She died at Parramatta in the year 1888, at the age of 88, having outlived James Greenacre by 51 years, and having never, so far as the papers of the New South Wales colony show, spoken publicly again of the man or of what had passed at Carpenter's buildings. Of the child George we know less. There is a boy of that name in the workhouse register at St. Mary, Newington, through the year 1840. After that the register is either lost or he is not in it. The George Gale of Kennington who appears in the school list of 1841 may be him, or may be another boy of a common enough name. I would like to tell you what became of him. I cannot. Hannah Brown, whose name we did not have for 6 weeks, and whose face we shall never have at all, was buried in the parish churchyard of St. Mary, Paddington, on the 18th of March, at the expense of her brother William, with the parish clerk and 2 churchwardens in attendance, and no other mourners. The register lists her age as 47, her condition as single, and her occupation as laundress. The grave has since been lost. The churchyard itself was closed for further burials in 1853, and was, in the years that followed, laid out as a public garden, and the stones that stood in it were moved to the wall along its eastern edge. Her stone, if it was ever cut, is not among them. We have come, you and I, to the end of what the record holds. The scaffold outside the Debtors' door was taken down before noon on the day of the hanging, and the boards of it stacked in the yard of the prison against the next occasion, which would come within the month. The ballad sellers of 7 Dials sold their sheets through the afternoon, and were gone by evening. The Magpie and Stump, on the corner, did its ordinary trade the following night. The Edgware Road, at Pineapple Gate, saw its half-built houses finished by the summer, and by the autumn a row of terraces stood on the ground where the labourer Bond had laid down his shovel in the fog and drawn back the sacking on a winter morning. The lock at Ben Jonson's still ran cold. The osier beds at Coldharbour Lane were cleared for a new road in the year 1840. The room at Carpenter's buildings was let, in the summer of that same year, to a new tenant, a carpenter and his wife, who lived in it for 11 years without incident. The lamp in the room where I am telling this has burned low. The city outside your window has grown very still. Somewhere, in a book on a shelf in a public library, the trial of James Greenacre is set out in 3 columns of small print, in a volume that is opened perhaps once in a generation. Somewhere, in a churchyard that is a garden now, a woman whose name was Hannah Brown lies without a stone. Somewhere, under the paving of a courtyard, a plot bears a number and no other word. And history, which does not judge the way the ballad sellers judged, and does not forget the way the streets forget, has turned the page, once more, into the dark.